Hello and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. This episode, it's that indie, known as High Life. On Cinema to the Letter, we break down the very nature of cinema, letter by letter. For each episode of a season topic, we cover 6 films that fit a C for classic, I for indie, N for new, E for egregious, M for masterpiece, and A for atypical. Because who doesn't love an acronym, am I right? I am Thomas, fresh out of a session in the fuck box. Just ready and mirror. And as I start before every single episode, I have a bit of time in the fuck box, I calm myself down.
You need some time in the box, you know?
Right, in the box.
Oh, man. Hi, I'm Bryan, and I'm just gonna lie my head in the garden and dissolve away.
Like the best of us, truly,
Yeah.
would do. But welcome, everyone. For this episode of Cinema to the Letter, it's our second episode of our Hard Sci-Fi season. And we're doing our Eye for Indie, which was chosen, we should mention, by our cineast patrons. Shout out at patreon.com/cinema2letter. More on that as we get to the end of the show. And they chose between, we had The Scanner Darkly and High Life. And unanimously, they chose High Life, which is very curious. Both very weird films, but I would argue this is the weirder one, probably. Weirdly less mainstream than the rotoscoped Richard Linklater movie.
Right, that movie is weird for just other reasons. It's Richard Linklater doing a Philip K. Dick adaptation. It's rotoscoped. Weird movie. But yes, this is a much stranger and weirder movie, and a movie I love, though. A movie I love. So
yes. Yeah. And before we get into the specific movie High Life, we should probably talk about hard sci-fi. Is kind of like, it's something we're still trying to determine over the course of this season, but we kind of talked about last week that basically we're going by more grounded science fiction, and that, in theory, would be easier to do with an indie title. But at the same time, it's obviously, harder to, kind of find a line. I mean, one that we didn't really consider because the person who made it's a piece of shit, but Primer.
Right.
It's kind of like what a lot of people point to in terms of, on a low budget, you can make something that has all these big scientific grandiose ideas that's just mainly more determined on the writing and quote unquote acting in that movie. For the record, even despite Shane Carruth being awful, I never liked Primer. I don't really get the appeal beyond it has some interesting time travel ideas, but that movie's so fucking boring to me.
it is a little boring. I remember it being, I liked it because of just how weird and kind of abstract it is and all that stuff. But yeah, I much prefer his other movies, although now I don't watch any of his movies because he's a piece of shit. So
yeah, fuck that guy. But yeah, Bryan, when we were coming up with those two titles for the patrons to pick between, was it difficult finding many others to think of in terms of the indie sci-fi? Because we had that problem with last week when we were talking about the Andromeda Strain. We had a bit of trouble picking a C for classic, but do you think there's a bit more options with the indie hard sci-fi?
Well, I think, and this is something we'll probably talk about as we get into the movie and stuff, but I think it's always interesting when there is a science fiction movie, especially a space science fiction movie, that is made on a very small level, or at least really anything smaller than $100 million. I think is really interesting because it's an indie movie, so you have to sort of, how do you portray space travel, and how do you portray just the ships and all this stuff that you need ideally a big budget for? How do you kind of portray that kind of stuff? There are a lot of indie movies, I think, that handle their science fiction elements in a really interesting way, like this movie, or like A Scanner Darkly, which, obviously everything's rotoscoped, so you can kind of play around a lot more and create a lot more elements and stuff like that. But I do think in indie movies, I think it's really interesting how I'm always interested when, especially auteurs make science fiction movies, but especially when it's on a very small scale. I think we see a lot more movies like that in the past couple decades, right? As like the kind of the barrier to entry is kind of a lot lower, right? So you can kind of do a lot more stuff with a lot less money nowadays. And so it allows, like, Claire Denis, someone who had never really made a movie like this, to make this kind of movie. But yeah, I think it's interesting when we get these kinds of movies that are not made with huge budgets or anything, but have very big ambitions to do like space, space travel and space science fiction and stuff like that. I don't know. How do you feel about it?
Well, especially curious with this movie that we're talking about today, which, another kind of programming behind the scenes thing. A lot of choices we were kicking around for, like, this or in the future our M for Masterpiece pick, a lot of them kind of come from around a sort of 10-year period, I would say, from, like, the late 2000s through to, like, the late 2010s. There's a lot of options in terms of just, like, this kind of hard sci-fi thing we're referring to. That's, like, in contrast to, our, like, C for Classic, like, plethora of different options to do. And we're, this is the one for our schedule that is from this 2010s period. And it's fascinating when you kind of look at it because, especially, this is a period that feels like it's bookended by in terms of just the United States, you've got, like, the end of the Bush era and, most of the Trump era kind of thing. So there's that weird kind of optimistic point in the middle where, we were foolhardy to think, like, oh, the black president, everything's going to be great. And we can,
everything's great in this country.
Right, explore the stars and all this other stuff. Because a lot of, like, American movies kind of have this hard sci-fi angle. Like, I rewatched recently, for the first time since the theater, Ridley Scott's The Martian, which is a movie that is... It's interesting rewatching because, one, still a great movie, but two, it is distinctly Obama's America era. Yes. Like, they'll have, like, we're going to science the shit out of this. Right. Feels very much like of that period.
Mm-hmm. There's an optimism in that movie of, like, we can all come together and accomplish this impossible mission because we can do it, and we're we can come together. Everything's great in this country. Nothing's wrong anymore.
Right, but that's in direct contrast to kind of, like, even what was going on at the time, even during the Obama era. Like, NASA was really on more of a downswing. There was stuff like, the different rovers and stuff like that were still going around. Then again, of course, I keep denouncing, like, the Trump era. Remember Space Force? When he declared Space Force to be a thing, and we got a great Netflix show that everybody likes out of it,
and everyone's still talking about that Netflix show to this day.
Totally, like every Netflix show, everyone talks about it constantly. But yeah, so it's just interesting, kind of like watching this movie, and as we'll go into detail about, a much more depressed movie about kind of like what we can put our scientific ingenuity toward, which is, bringing the prison industrial complex and the horrors of humanity to the stars!
Yes, to space, yes. Right. It's a fascinating thing to, I think, talk about, especially in this movie. But, yeah, and it feels especially, this came out 2018, 2019, like, right in the middle of, like, Trump's presidency, right? And so it really feels, like, of its time.
Though, of course, this is made by a French filmmaker who probably didn't have as much of that. I'm sure, we'll talk about this, but Claire Denis is not necessarily the most optimistic filmmaker in most cases. Like, even when she makes, say, like, a light romantic comedy, it has a tinge of, like, sadness and ennui to it.
Right. I mean, even, like, certain movies I like of hers, like 35 Shots of Rum, which is, like, maybe one of my top 10 favorite movies, which is a very sweet and, like, beautiful movie, still has a real tinge of sadness, a cloud hanging over it in some ways. But yes, she is a very kind of antagonistic filmmaker in a lot of ways, in a good way, though.
Right. Before we get into the movie specifically, I do want to at least circle back to one other thing. This is our space exploration movie for this season. Right. We kind of consciously want to differentiate things. Like, we had last week, we had, like, an alien virus movie. This week, we're having, like, an actual movie that goes into sort of, like, a more grounded space exploration that could feel plausible in theory. How do you feel about that sort of thing? Because we talked about The Martian a bit as well, like, all these kind of things. How do you feel about that kind of, like, more grounded space exploration in terms of hard sci-fi? What's your kind of favorite version of that?
Well, I think it's difficult to do because you have to kind of imagine, like, what will space travel actually look like, right? What will the ship actually look like? What will, like, people be wearing and stuff like that? And, like, I always think of, like, Solaris, the Andrei Tarkovsky movie, which is very different to, like, 2001, right? Where 2001 is very clean and, like, sterile and, you know, all of that. Solaris is very, like, industrial, you know, it's a lot grimier and dirtier. And of course you have that in, like, an American movie would be like Alien, right? Like, everything is dirty, they're like truckers basically and stuff like that. And so for me, I think it you know, this movie has kind of like these spacesuits that look realistic, right? Like, they look like, you know, they're not the 2001 like just perfect like dome, all like red and gorgeous, like, you know, all brand new. Like, they look kind of like it's a bunch of pieces coming together in like as an astronaut suit. And just the look of the ship and stuff like that it feels very grounded, and it feels very much like it could exist in our world, right? Like, whoever, if NASA wanted to, like, in, I don't know, 10, 20 years, like, I could see these spacesuits looking like this. And there's a lot of stuff in this movie that I think feels very, you know, like it could take place now, but obviously with a much more futuristic science fiction twist to it. And I think just like how much of this movie has a lot of those analog kind of sets and stuff like that. I'm really not a fan of, like, another Ridley Scott movie, Prometheus, which has a lot of those like holographic kind of things where it's just people doing like the Minority Report kind of thing. Yeah. Where that just doesn't feel as plausible to me anymore, really. Like, you know, that's not really where the future's headed. Like, iPhones and iPads are kind of like the norm, right? Yeah, I don't know. I think this is kind of one of the more, like, quote-unquote realistic versions of, like, a spaceship and what space travel might actually be like. To some extent, obviously. There's, you know, it's still kind of a movie that really cares about the science, but it is still a Claire Denis movie, and she has a story to tell and stuff like that. But that was my very long rant.
No, I mean, no, I get that, because, I mean, it's interesting when you kind of look at a lot of these movies are very indebted to less, you know, fictional versions of this, like The Right Stuff, and especially like Apollo 13, which I always kind of point to in terms of, like, you know, depicting zero gravity and all this other stuff, which I recently, because I finally got a 4K television recently, Brian.
Okay.
And my first movie to test it out was my 4K of Apollo 13.
Oh, okay.
Which you've had kind of waiting for it. And for the record, I think perfect one to put out, because, like, that movie looks stunning, especially all the, like, floating around in space and stuff like that stuff is so phenomenally done. So weird that Ron Howard made that movie, and it's easily, I think, his best movie.
Yeah, it might be, actually, yeah.
It's either that or Backdraft, and Backdraft is just fucking weird. That's an insane movie.
That's the firefighter one, right?
Oh, it's so much more than that, Brian. There's, like, a whole thing with recent R.I.P. Donald Sutherland playing, like, a weird Hannibal Lecter serial killer in the middle of that movie. It's strange. Like, he's Hannibal Lecter, but as, like, an arsonist. And fucking, like, Kurt Russell has to, like, talk to him, like, you son of a bitch. I can't believe you did this. It's a very weird movie. In terms of, like, the Apollo 13 of it all, that movie, I feel like, kind of set a lot of the groundwork for what any movie in the last, you know, almost 30 years has done in terms of, like, depicting space travel, depicting zero gravity, depicting all this other stuff. It's kind of like the natural kind of base that a lot of these other filmmakers have kind of explored with. You know, sometimes you get something like Gravity, which would technically count as, like, a hard sci-fi, even though it's much more grounded in terms of, like, what it's doing than even, you know, like, this movie or much of the other, like, hard sci-fi things. Or, you know, with High Life, the designs of, like, the spacesuits and the spaceships and stuff like that, it almost kind of feels like an 80s movie depicting, like, a future setting.
Yeah, right. But they still have, like, computers, right? Like, it's like they have, like, monitors and just kind of, like...
But even those are, like, very basic, and they have, like, the kind of, like, early, like, look to them, which, you know what, let's just get into our movie. Here's the trailer for High Life.
Dada?
She's mine.
Dada.
I'm hers. We were scum. Trash. Refuse that didn't fit into the system. Until someone had the bright idea of recycling us to serve science.
I know I look like a witch.
You're foxy and you know it.
You lied to us. You knew it.
The sensation, moving backwards, even though we're moving forwards, getting further from what's getting nearer.
There is nothing to fear. Everything's gonna be fine.
Are you sick? You realize nothing is ever gonna grow inside us?
Break the laws of nature. You'll pay for it.
So High Life came out, as we kind of mentioned, in France on November 8th, 2018, and in the United States on April 5th, 2019, which is appropriate given the director and co-writer is Claire Denis, who, we should just state right off the bat, this is our first movie directed by a female director that we've done for the show. We're terrible allies. It took us 32 episodes to get to that point. But also it's our first A24 film, which is fascinating to think about as well in terms of this. But to get back to Claire Denis, so you're more familiar with Denis' filmography, correct?
Yeah, I think so. Around the time High Life was coming out, I remember hearing, of course, that it was a Robert Pattinson space sci-fi movie, and I was like, I want that right now, please. I would love to see that. And then, of course, as it I think it premiered at Cannes or no TIFF. There was a lot of reports of there's a scene where Juliette Binoche goes into something called a fuck box, and I was like, I need to see this movie right now. This sounds insane.
By the way, no sci-fi term for it, no just anything. It is called a fuck box throughout the film. There's no technical term for it beyond fuck box.
They say the box, but then I think Andre 3000 does say the fuck box at some point.
We know his name's Andre Benjamin. We're just gonna call him Andre 3000.
Of course, yeah. But around that time, I think I started kind of watching a lot of her movies, and I really just became fascinated by just her filmmaking and her style. And then the problem, of course, with a lot of Claire Denis movies, which I think has kind of been rectified in the past few years, but is that a lot of her movies just aren't really available on streaming or anything like that, and especially not on physical media, right? 35 Shots of Rum, which I mentioned, is not available any physical copies. It's not on streaming. Every once in a while it will pop up on Mubi or the Criterion channel. I really just love her style, and I think just learning about her career, right, where she was an assistant director on Paris, Texas, and worked with Wim Wenders, and I think also was I think she was the AD on one early Jarmusch movie. I think it was Down by Law.
Okay.
I can't remember exactly, but I know she did work with them, and so yeah, just kind of going through her filmography, watching more of her movies, watching some of her newer movies. I just really love her style, and I guess we can dive a little bit deeper as we get into the movie and stuff like that. But I'm a huge fan of her movies. I've seen a few of them. There's a few I haven't seen, but I know that you have watched a few of them in preparation for this. So yeah, I want to hear kind of which ones you dived into.
Well, yeah, I mean, High Life was the first one I saw of hers. I had been aware of that name, but I just had not seen any of her movies. And I was after I saw High Life, and spoilers, really loved it, I was like, oh, I should watch more of her movies. And then like a filthy American, I didn't do that for a very long time. Until, in prep for this, I'm like, I'm going to finally watch at least as many as I can. I had a bit of a busy weekend, so I didn't have as much time to sit down with them. So, but over the last few days, I've watched a couple more of hers. Amongst those, of course, I watched Beau Travail, right? That's how it's pronounced? Beau
I've heard people say Beau Travail.
Beau Travail, yeah.
As opposed to not doing the travail, like the French, kind of thing.
Right, pretending you're French for a second.
Right.
Just I love me some Beau Travail. You know what I mean, I reckon, But yeah, I watched that finally. I'd heard so much about that movie. Obviously, that's kind of was her breakout movie, right? In a lot of ways, at least or the one that she's at least most famous for in international circles.
It is her most famous movie, and I think is maybe the one that I think she's kind of most known for. I think it's a masterpiece. I've seen it like multiple times now, and it just keeps growing on me. I think you get a real sense of like her interests in that movie of just colonialism. I don't want to say male toxicity because that just kind of feels a bit reductive, but guys being dudes, I guess, is kind of how I would put that.
Definitely a guys being dudes kind of filmmaker. Also, very crucially, people dancing at clubs, which I was aware of, like, that happens a lot throughout that movie, but it's also, like, a recurring theme that I noticed throughout, like, all of these. It's like, there will be points where just somebody's, like, sadly dancing at a club, and it's like, yeah, I get that. That makes sense. But, yeah, I think that movie's great as well. I don't know if I would be quite on the masterpiece train, because I liked a few other ones a bit more, honestly. Like, I'll say, maybe this is a hot take, but I really liked Let the Sun Shine In, which is her 2017 movie with Juliette Binoche, which is just about her kind of, you know, wandering around from, like, different relationship, just kind of, like, trying to, you know, feel herself out as, like, a middle-aged woman, trying to, you know, get some kind of love in her life, and I found it, like, so engrossing and beautiful and funny, but also very sad in its own way. And, you know, hot take, Juliette Binoche is a really good actress who's very attractive. Hot take. I'm really breaking all sorts of barriers by saying these things.
Yeah, that's when I need to revisit that one, because I saw it when it kind of, I think after High Life I went back and saw it, but it's been a while. But yeah, that's a good movie.
Yeah, very good movie. Earlier today I watched Stars at Noon, which was her follow-up to High Life. Right, because she also did a different French movie with Vincent London, right? That same year?
Yes, which has a title called... The American title is Both Sides of the Blade.
Right.
But the French title is With Love and Determination. That's a better title, I think. And I remember it being called something like really stupid in America. And there was this interview with her where she was like, why is that the title? Like, that is not the title of the movie. She was like kind of annoyed by it.
Incredible interview, by the way, Claire Denis. Just like such a fascinating, like, doesn't give two fucks about like saying shit like this title is dumb. What are you talking about?
Yeah, also seems like a terrifying person to be in the same room with as well. You know, and I think that comes across in her filmmaking. But how did you feel about Stars at Noon, by the way? Because I watched that this weekend as well.
That's easily my least favorite, honestly, of the ones I watched. There's interesting stuff, and I mean, Margaret Qualley is a star, so I'm no issues necessarily with her, and also Joe Alwyn, who I didn't really know that well beyond being Taylor Swift's ex, honestly.
This is the movie that, because Margaret Qualley is married to Jack Antonoff, her producer,
right.
Of course, of like Bleachers fame and stuff like that. So when they were filming this movie, Taylor Swift and Jack Antonoff made an album together, which was Midnights. And
right.
Taylor Swift made that post where she was like, our partners were shooting a movie. And I was like, I just kept thinking like, shoot, they were shooting this fucking weird Claire Denis movie. That's so weird to think about.
I mean, but not even that weird, honestly. Like, because it's about, like, Margaret Qualley plays, like, this journalist who's stuck in Nicaragua during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think it approaches some interesting stuff about kind of, like, you know, being, like, lost in a different place and the kind of the xenophobia that Qualley kind of has about, you know, this environment despite, like, kind of being stuck in it. And also, so that's interesting, but I think the movie, like, trails off so quickly. It doesn't have a lot there, really.
It is a very long movie. I do really, really like it, though, and I think it, like, also has kind of those colonialist themes in terms of, like, the American intervention going on there, and I think, you know, a thing that I really like about her movies in terms of, like, that whole political angle is how it's always there, and it's very much a part of her movies. Even something like Beau Travail is very much about, like, French colonialism in Africa, in West Africa. She knows just how much to give you, I think, without it feeling like, okay, I get it, I get what you're talking about, but just enough to where it's always in the back of your mind, and it's a very important part of her stories that she makes. And but I will agree with you, that movie is kind of long, but I do really like it, and it features John C. Reilly in one great scene, I think.
Literally phoning in a scene just saying, like, fuck you, Margaret Qualley, I'm not going to give you any money. Goodbye. And Benny Safdie's also pretty fun. He shows up very late in the movie. But still, I don't know. Not my favorite necessarily of these. But right before we started recording, I did just finish Trouble Every Day, which is her very odd take on a vampire movie that I found incredibly upsetting and vitriolic. A lot of people say it kind of is the opening to the French Extremity period. Like, it's very early in that era, which is a portion of film I've mostly avoided, quite frankly, just because I'm like, I don't know if I want to watch, like, Inside and shit like that just sounds like, oh, this seems, like, oppressively awful in a weird way. As opposed to that movie, at least, is a lot more fascinating because it feels a lot more, like, weirdly sort of character-driven, though at the same time really quiet. Like, it's weird how that's technically her first largely English language movie, and there's some French in there, but it's mostly a silent movie. There's barely any fucking dialogue in that movie.
Yes, which is something I love about her movies, is how much she likes to sit in just ambiance, or just kind of in silence, and just kind of, often you're just watching people do things, and there isn't really an explanation of like what they're doing. They're not talking, and it is purely visual. And I don't know, that's something I really love, especially in Trouble Every Day. I think that movie is so fucking great, and also just a great vampire movie. Also has that sort of weirdly, in a very horrific kind of way, is very romantic in a very dark and like, very body horror as well. There's something about that movie that I think just is so alluring. And, something I find really with all her movies is just this, they all have this really hypnotic quality to them. And I think the silence really kind of adds to that, right? Like, because there's not a lot of dialogue in her movies, because you have, we'll get to the music angle of her movies as well, because I think that's very crucial. But, there's something quite hypnotic and alluring about all of her movies, that they really just draw you in. And I think it's one of the reasons I just kind of always go back to her movies, and I just, I'm always curious to see what she does next.
It also helps that she tends to hire like very unique looking actors. Like, in terms of Trouble Every Day, the actress Beatrice Dalle, who is like so immediately distinctive, where she's like incredibly beautiful on like more traditional levels, and then she has like the gap in her tooth that instantly makes her like stand up, which is like, whoa, wow, this is very odd, like kind of a weird version of like the vampire fangs. It likes to hire distinctive, interesting looking actors like her, or I believe actual vampire Vincent Gallo in that movie, who just, despite him being like a New York, like I believe he was born like Buffalo, New York, like born actor, looks like the dictionary definition of European scumbag.
Yeah.
Like, just like the photo for that. He's so like odd, especially in that movie, where he's our lead, but he just kind of like whimpers like this the whole time.
He does.
Just talking about, I was really into this girl, and then she married a different scientist guy.
But getting someone like Vincent Gallo, who I think is visually very striking, I think is clearly very important to like her filmmaking, right? Because she doesn't have a lot of dialogue, and so if you just have Vincent Gallo there, and he is like, look, he's a very complicated man, but he's a very hot man, I will admit. In the movies I've seen him in, he's a very attractive man, and just has a very striking like visual presence. And you get that, of course, with Robert Pattinson in this movie, or I think with Joe Alwyn in Stars at Noon, although that one's a bit more of like it's a bit more complicated than that. But another movie I watched of hers recently called Bastards, which is kind of more of a kind of dark thriller, and also has Vincent Lindon, who, I mean, if anyone has seen Vincent Lindon, of course, in Titan, but in general, he is like such a visually striking man.
Yes.
And
or even Dennis Levant in of course, like a very distinctive, like very specific look on that guy.
Yes, of course. And yeah, and I think she just really cares a lot about just what her actors look like, and I don't know, that just is always really interesting to me, especially in regards to High Life.
Let's just get into High Life now. Let's get more distinctly into it. So, if you're unaware of High Life, basic premise of this one, it's interesting because this one is told in a non-linear structure, because we open on a little baby in a crib on a space station, and we see that she's communicating in her own goo goo gaga sort of way with our lead Robert Pattinson, who is outside the space station trying to fix some panels and stuff. And literally, as he's trying to do this, the baby's crying, and he's trying to calm her down over the radio, and he loses grip on a tool, and it's gone forever in the recesses of space. So while we kind of see him, basically on the space station trying to, take care of this infant, he occasionally flashes back to his past, where we see a lot of stuff where he was apparently a juvenile delinquent of some sort, where we see that his closest connection was to his dog, who ended up being killed, and thus he ended up retaliating and being put into the juvenile detention system after that. And through these flashbacks, we get the indication that the reason he's in space is because he originally went up with a crew of other young juvies who grew up to be part of the prison industrial complex, who were put onto a spaceship as a sort of weird, basically suicide mission that the government put them on, of like, look, you can either face death, because you're literally on death row, we will, kill you through the traditional prison system, or you can take this opportunity to be a part of this program where we'll send you into space along with some more, scientific experts and stuff. Basically, you'll be cattle.
Guinea pigs, right.
Who can help do manual labor and scientific experiments and stuff while up there. The main mission of this space travel is to investigate a black hole and potentially harness some energy out of that and bring it back to Earth as an alternate fuel source. And so he's up there along with a group of misfits that include Mia Goth and Andre 3000 and Ewan Mitchell, a.k.a. buff-looking Bo Burnham.
Rewatching this movie, I was like, where have I seen him very recently? And he's the fucking little nerd from Saltburn as well.
Right? Dude looks like buff Bo Burnham, especially having watched this now after Inside, which has a lot of that weird kind of blue lighting and stuff like that for Bo Burnham in this movie. He's mostly cascaded in blue, which is just even more underlined that connection to me.
I guess Bo Burnham's been rocking the beard recently, and he's very clean shaven. But yeah, they do look very similar. Huh.
That's true. Yes, but anyway, Pattinson is go between him raising this young infant and him being a part of these weird experiments that are done in transit to space, mainly by evil mad sex scientist Juliette Binoche, who does, as we mentioned, likes to go into the fuck box to let off some steam, both figuratively and literally, in the case of the machinery. And it's a very normal movie.
Very normal.
Right, but you've seen these so many times. This came out the same summer as Avengers Endgame, a very similar film.
Yeah. Well, and so it's funny that their first mission is the black hole situation, and then there is this sub-objective that Juliette Binoche's character has that is implied to be basically she wants to conceive and raise a baby as they're in space, moving incredibly fast, and she wants to basically see, is that possible, because she's kind of insane. She's also kind of a criminal in a way. We kind of learn a few things about what happened to her family and her children.
Right. And plus, I think, isn't the implication that there's a bit more of a population issue on Earth because of sort of radiation and stuff? So it's also kind of experiment in that way with their reproductive systems?
Yes, right, yes. Because, that's the whole thing, is that there is radiation, so it has been killing the babies in the womb. And, I mean, this is the thing I really love about this movie, though, is kind of how vague everything is.
Yeah.
Right? And as we discussed a bit with Claire Denis, she often does this, where she will just start the movie, and as an audience member, you are just kind of confounded as to what's happening, who are these people, and especially this movie where you're watching just Robert Pattinson and a baby interact for 20 minutes, and you're getting very short kind of slices of you'll see the shot of Mia Goth in the spacesuit as she's on zero gravity, or just kind of random floods of images that come through. And it's something I love about her movies is that you can walk into one of her movies and just, even if you know what the plot is, there is still kind of a lot of figuring out you have to do on the fly, which I think is something I just love in any movie, and especially when she doesn't explain anything to you and you're having to pick it up through comments people are making or just an image, and you're saying like, oh, I think that's what happened. You're right. You're putting the pieces together yourself, and that's something I just really love about movies in general, but specifically her movies, because she trusts the audience enough to catch up at a certain point and pick up what's going on, and maybe you are filling in some of the blanks yourself. You're putting your own kind of like implications onto it and stuff like that. And yeah, basically for the first kind of half hour, 45 minutes, we are just getting kind of flashes, and then by the end of the movie we kind of have kind of an entire picture of what's happening here, but it's still like not entirely clear.
Right, but even then, we are also, like, a recurring thing in at least the films of hers that I've seen. There's also kind of a factor of, like, we're getting a very specific skewed perspective on these things right. From, like, our main character, who kind of has, like, a bit of an unreliable narrator kind of scenario. That's the case with, like, Bo and even Treble Every Day, that there's a bit more of, like, a skewed perspective that we get things from. It helps to kind of, like you mentioned, kind of help us piece together things that, like, we aren't quite seeing at the same time. Like you mentioned, she leaves a lot to the imagination. And I think that's what especially interested me with High Life, because it is so much of, like, a movie about kind of, like, memory, especially when you're, kind of stuck in a situation, in this case, of, like, hey, I'm literally in space, hurtling toward a black hole, and the only companion I have is a child I'm raising, basically. After a certain point. It's incredibly fascinating, especially, I just want to also say right off the bat, this is a more recent movie. And before we go into any more detail, I want to recommend anybody watch this, though I will underline and emphasize that this is a very divisive movie. Like, I was looking at Letterboxd at, like, people I follow and stuff who, a lot of, like, all over the boards kind of, like, reactions to it. Not everyone is necessarily a fan. And content warning, it gets, some of the sexual elements get to be a bit more violent from certain characters and stuff. There's some uncomfortable stuff that's in here, but at the same time, I do find it just incredibly fascinating, because it's a movie, like we mentioned, essentially about, hey, let's get all of our, sort of troubling elements of society that we don't want to really confront on Earth, shoot them into space, and maybe they can help us out by discovering an alternate fuel source kind of deal. It's basically just like, hey, let's, kind of shoot our problems into space, and maybe we'll come back with gold? Maybe. Who knows?
Yeah, it's the thing that I think she's, again, like her political elements, I think it is this idea also that they will, like, serve science, right? Like, they are, helping figure out, like, these scientific problems that we have or whatever. But yeah, it is something that's certainly interesting about this movie, about how, how do we treat, like, the prison population, and especially, like, again, even though she's a French filmmaker, this movie, of course, being released, in America and having a lot of American actors and stuff, really does resonate, especially, again, as this was released during the Trump administration. And yeah, it's such a fascinating way to handle the idea of, like, who is our crew going to be? And it's like, oh, it's a bunch of criminals, and even, like, our head doctor is a criminal as well. The only really, like, scene we get where she even addresses kind of what's happening is a very brief train interview where some guy is just like, is this how we want to deal with our problems? Just have these prisoners be guinea pigs and we'll shoot them into space? And that's all you really need to kind of start putting the pieces together as to, like, why is this happening? What's going on here? And stuff like that.
Yeah, by the way, Bryan's literally talking about, like, this professor of some sort is being interviewed for, like, I think a podcast or something like that. What a dorky thing to be on. But just talking about, like, don't they know that, like, because of the way, you travel in space, and as is explained here, they age at, like, a much more kind of, like, slow down rate than we would on Earth. And so It's like, by the time that he says at one point, this professor guy, like, we'll be dust by the time they even come back, if they come back at all. He's very much outlining the idea that, like, no, this is like a suicide mission ostensibly. There's not, even if they get over there, they're probably not going to survive in space with, like, whatever kind of, like, equipment they have up there, which is part of what I love about the production design of this movie, is that, we talked about kind of like the 2001 version of traveling in space, and just, like, the ship looks pristine, and the spacesuits and all this other stuff. Everything here is, like, practical, in a way
that's a
where
great word for it.
it feels like, this is a government-funded thing, so of course everything is just good enough to, like, survive. Like, the spacesuits, the actual look of the fucking... Like, this spaceship looks like a shitty-ass, like, office building in certain areas. Like, it looks, like, so shitty. But, like, there's literally a point where Pattinson's, like, banging on what looks like an air conditioning vent, like a normal, shitty air conditioning vent.
Oh, right,
With the
yeah.
baby and stuff like that. Just, like, this is all, like, barely able to stitch together because of government funding.
Right. And like, even later on when we see, like, when years have passed by and we see, like, panels off the wall and just kind of, like, everything has fallen apart, where it's like, yeah, this thing isn't meant to, like, last, like, decades, right? It's not. And practical is a great word for it. I think I love the look of it. It doesn't look too clean. It doesn't look like Apple designed this or something like that. Like, it looks like, like you said, like a government designed this to be, like, functional at best.
Right. Yes. Where, like, it won't die because of, like, complete shoddiness. It's just, like, it'll work, though, right? It's kind of like, if you go to, like, a public school. And it's just like, this will basically function to make sure these people don't die in here for the amount of time they're in here.
Right. You can sit in the desk. It might, like, rock back and forth, and it's one leg's missing maybe, but, like, it works.
But it won't fall apart, because then you could sue us. It's just good enough to where it won't fall apart.
And, well, one of the things that, like, the doctor, who, again, is not a character in this movie. We never see him again. It's just that one scene. But early on we see, like, him sending messages back to Earth, and he mentions, like, we'll get their messages, like, I think that's the line he has, is like, we'll be bone dust by the time we even get the messages,
Right.
And so it is showing just not just the suicide mission nature of it, but just the, like, despair of, like, the situation of, like, this is horrible that we're doing this, and, like, it's just this hopeless mission basically.
I guess let's talk a bit more about our leading man, who we've mentioned a few times, but Robert Pattinson stars in this film. And this is definitely part of kind of the Pattinson sort of reclamation project that that he was on. He was very, obviously, like, came to prominence with the Twilight films. And, I can admit being a teenage boy, being an asshole about just, like, sharing around, like, the meme where it's, like, Edward and Bella and then Blades behind them, which admittingly is a very funny meme.
Yes.
It's a very funny picture, but at the same time, it's part of that kind of, like, weird cultural thing where it's just like, oh, wait, teenage girls have something that they like that's very popular?
We must pile onto it, right? Yeah.
Right, how dare they have that? But it's been very interesting, seeing Pattinson kind of, like, take the massive amounts of money he made off those movies, and, kind of progress into doing just weirder things that, like, few other people would do, like, in the similar way to, like, Daniel Radcliffe did after the Harry Potter movies, or maybe his Twilight co-star, as we might talk about next week. Point a pin in that.
Oh, yeah, we are.
It's interesting, the back-to-back kind of thing there. But, yeah, what is your history with Pattinson?
Well, you're also forgetting one other franchise he was in, which was the Harry Potter franchise, he's only in Goblet of Fire. But that, I think, was the first time I ever saw him, and I ever really kind of saw how he's a very unique-looking actor, right? Like, he looks like a vampire, of course, but that was the first time I ever saw him, and like you said, like, similar to you, I also made fun of him and Kristen Stewart for the Twilight movies and just, all of that stuff. But I think the first time I saw him in a movie after Twilight was I saw The Rover in theaters, because I was like, it was, I think, an A24 movie as well. This was early in the A24, and it was Guy Pearce and Scoot McNairy was in it. I was a big Scoot head when I was a teenager.
You were boot scooting all over the place.
Oh, man, yeah. And I remember seeing him in that, and he's very good in that, and giving a very just wild and weird performance in that movie. I think 2017 is when he has The Lost City of Zed and Good Time, which I think Good Time was like a huge moment for me for like just becoming obsessed with Pattinson, and I think that's that's his best performance, and I think just one of the best performances I've seen of the past decade, maybe. Yeah, and so I think Good Time really solidified, like, okay, no, this guy is one of our like best working actors. And then I think I went back and watched like his two Cronenberg movies he made, Cosmopolis and Maps to the Stars, both of which I really like. I know they're kind of like more divisive Cronenberg movies, but I really like those movies. I think he's really great in them. And yeah, like since then he's just, obviously in this and The Lighthouse are this year. And
Yeah.
he's also just been kind of in his weird, like, I do weird voices, like in The King or The Devil All the Time, both kind of bad movies, but
He lights up Devil all the time.
Yes,
When that movie's
absolutely.
at its most kind of like, this is like the most boring, dull,
Right. Mm-hmm.
like cynical, shitty movie, and then he just comes in as like basically a King of the Hill character. And I say this as 100% a compliment.
yes, no, absolutely. He has kind of proven himself that he will work with weird, interesting indie directors like the Safdies or, the Zellner brothers. He made that movie Damsel, or Robert Eggers or just whoever. But he also is just like a freak and just a really weird man. A quote around the time this movie came out where he was like, "Yeah, I just lie in a bunch of interviews and people just believe me." It's
Which you
like,
can
what?
tell if you go back to like the press interviews for Twilight. Him and Kristen
Yeah.
Stewart. I think the reason they kind of had like a relationship at one point is because they both just like fucking with press throughout all those movies, which is very sweet and endearing from the two of them. But yeah, I think I had a similar thing where like I remember I watched Cosmopolis around the time it came out, which was I believe the same time as like Breaking Dawn Part 2. Where he's in that movie, which I was not a fan of then, still quite not a fan of. That's probably one of my least favorite Cronenberg movie, quite frankly. But at the very least, he's like, really, I was very respectful I was very impressed that he was just like, he's isolating himself. He's basically just like the one lead character of this movie who other people just come in and out of the story. And he's just like kind of the main focus we get the entire time. And I found that really fascinating. And then I would say Good Time was like the point where I also was cemented like, oh my God,
Yeah.
this movie's fucking crazy. And Pattinson is just fully committed to the bit, just like running around the way he does in that movie, just being a fucking the biggest scumbag, but at the same time so
accent.
fascinating. You want to follow him. And then what like really cements is like, oh no, he's one of our great actors to me is Lighthouse. Truly. Like him especially have a two-hander with Dafoe. That is incredibly intimidating as a prospect. Like, hey, it's just you and Willem Dafoe. Go act next to him. And he really commits to that as well. He really steps up in such a fascinating way. I'm like, okay, I'm diehard Pattinson, whatever you want to fucking do, dude. And I think High Life is another great example of that, where so much of this movie, at least half of it, maybe even a bit more, is him interacting with an infant, which we should credit that the baby who plays the infant is his goddaughter,
Oh yeah.
Scarlett Lindsay. Apparently there was a whole conflict where like they originally had a couple twin babies that were going to play the Willow character at an infant stage, and Pattinson apparently had a rough time bonding with them. He couldn't quite find any kind of connection, so he decided very last minute to get like, his buddy who he was like the goddaughter to his, child, like, hey, can you bring your baby over? Can we just like use her on set? And the two of them together are so sweet in such a weird way. It feels very natural father-daughter chemistry that feels very like believable, particularly as you just have like the baby do stuff with him, like pat him on the head, or my favorite being like when they're in like a little garden area and she starts eating something, he's like, hey, no, don't do that. And then she just like gets something and like puts it in his mouth.
The strawberry,
And it's
yeah.
the strawberry. It's so sweet.
Yeah, the first kind of like 30 to 45 minutes of this movie, excluding all of the kind of intercut footage that we get, so sweet and beautiful and like tender. And I think it's the thing about Claire Denis where, yes, this movie is incredibly upsetting and has so many like fucked up things, like a lot of her movies, but she never loses sight of just that sweetness and that tenderness. You need it to draw you in, of course, but you also just need it because, especially if you've never seen this movie before, you're just like, what is happening? Who is this baby? Where did they come from? Why is Pattinson on this ship alone? Blah, all that stuff. And just kind of seeing them interact is so adorable. And one of the things I love about Claire Denis as well is how much she portrays like intimacy really well. And she has like, I mean, no one does close-ups like her, but like just seeing the two of them like in the bed when he's like changing her or when he's just, whatever, taking care of her, there's just such an intimacy there that you really get a feel for like the bond that these two have, even if you're not sure what it is yet. Like is this his daughter? Is it someone else's daughter? Where did she come from? All that stuff.
Right, which is what intrigued me, because I went into this movie basically blind when I ended up seeing it. I was unaware beyond, like, space movie with Pattinson. Like, cool. Okay, I'm curious about this.
This will have no cum in it whatsoever.
No, it will not come into the equation to any degree. But what really sold me, like, very early in this movie is, like, that, like you mentioned, like, the chemistry between those two being so cute. But then the moment where he first introduces the idea of, like, oh, I have to feed the dog, which in this movie is code for he has to go up to the computer, which is programmed basically to, like, give life support for a 24-hour period, depending on, like, these logs that he gives about, like, I replaced some panels, I did this, and then it says, like, on there, like, granted 24 hours of life support services, which it really is such an interesting whiplash from what you're talking about, the cute sweetness of, like, oh, he's taking care of this baby, that's so great, and then it really smacks you back into the reality of, like, they are on limited supplies.
Right.
Which sets up this, like, recurring thing that I don't know, like, well, I think we'll get into this more as, like, we get to near the end of the movie, but it's just very fascinating about kind of, like, the concept of being, I don't know, a person who is trying to raise a child in an upsetting circumstance where, like, resources become limited. There's a lot more isolation involved. It's fascinating, especially, like, when I watched it back in 2019, I felt this, and I feel it even more strongly in, say, I don't know, the past 5 years after this movie came out, watching a guy kind of being in isolation and wondering how we can, like, dwindle certain supplies that he has. It affected me even more on an emotional level. Just that struggle where it's like you want to take care of this human being that you love so much, but it's like, I don't know, man, the world around you is not helping to any degree with that.
I think she also does a great job in this movie of portraying how isolating it must feel to be up in space and just how scary it is as well. Like, lots of movies that are set in space, of course, even 2001, of course, are about, hey, space is, like, kind of the scariest thing in the world if you really think about it for, like, any amount of time. And I think this movie really gets that, and especially in that isolation, because you just get so much of, like, oh, they're just alone on this entire spaceship, and there's no one for, like, millions and millions of miles, and it is, like, kind of terrifying in a way.
Though we both want to sign up for whenever Elon finally colonizes Mars.
Elon would absolutely do something like this fucking stupid, I think, right? Like, as, like, fucked up as, like, the premise of this movie is, it is not outside of, like, the realm of possibility in, like, the horrible world we live in for, like, something like this to happen.
Though he would want to do that with, like, a bunch of other, like, asshole, like, billionaire blue checks on Twitter.
Oh.
He wouldn't want to do that with, like, prisoners, common prisoners. That's not his scene. It's, I don't know, like, Rick and Morty fans or whatever he wants to go up into space with. You know, maybe that's our version of the prison system. Let Elon and all those, like, assholes, like, go up into space. Sure. Go ahead, guys. Have fun.
Yeah. Oh, man.
Say hi to the black hole for us.
Oh, man. God, where do we go from there? I do want to talk a bit about the music, not just in this movie, but in general in her filmography, because she has always worked with this band called Tindersticks, which is this band from, like, the early 90s. They're a British band, and they've scored a lot of her movies, including, like, Trouble Every Day and Stars at Noon. And I think they're very crucial to her style because, you know, like I said, I mentioned the kind of hypnotic quality her movies have, and I think that is really added by the music by Tindersticks, which is very moody and kind of sparse and jazzy and really ambient. And one of my favorite, like, themes is from Trouble Every Day, just like that opening theme, which just really sets, like, the mood and the tone, and just, like, Stuart Staples' like vocals are so, like, distinctive and, like, I don't know, just drenched in this, like, you know, like, you know, the music in this movie and just kind of the sound of this movie is so, like, gorgeous. And I think it's also a wash in that kind of, like, you know, oppressive droning at times, right? Like, during the very stressful sequences, but it's also very light and just creates, like, this, you know, during the sequences where it's Pattinson and the baby, it just creates this very, like, beautiful, like, you know, sweet moments. I don't know. I just love her collaborations with Tindersticks. I find it really interesting that, like, a filmmaker and a band can collaborate to do music. Usually it's just like one member from the band or something like that.
Her John Williams is like a French jazz band, basically. I think that's fascinating because like there's a real contrast to like the stuff that we get in flashbacks where we see more of these inmates on the ship before everything completely dismantles, and then the like you're mentioning the stuff where it's just Willow and Pattinson's character Monty, which we should mention, very interesting character name. To quote Andre 3000, was that you folks Italian? Talk about his name, right? But yeah, that kind of like the almost like lullaby kind of like tenderness of the music, particularly the ending song named after Willow. The Willow song I think is like a beautiful kind of like way to lead into the end credits.
Sung by Pattinson himself as well.
Yes, Denis. I think a big thing just from like the 5 films of hers that I've seen. A master leading into end credits. Just like,
I mean,
so masterful with it. And even in the case, like say, like Let the Sunshine in, more spoilers. The last scene is just over the end credits.
Some critic I think made like a tweet or a Letterboxd review that was like, "Fuck post-credit scenes. This is an in-credit scene."
But yeah, I think I agree with you that I think that the music works so well, and I think it really benefits like for the way that she depicts space travel, which we should talk about how like this is around the same time that you're getting like, we mentioned The Martian, but Interstellar, a few other things where we're seeing like new versions of what we got back in like 2001: A Space Odyssey. Just seeing a lot of filmmakers take advantage of like how much technology had advanced. And I think this movie does such a great job of having that stuff be kind of stark with the set design we're mentioning, but even like when we get people in space, like there's a whole sequence with Mia Goth having hijacked a little space vessel, just depicting space for the hostile, unfeeling, cruel darkness that it is. Yeah. And I find it fascinating because it feels so very matter of fact in a way that really works for like obviously like so many of her other movies that are earthbound are just about like, we're watching people kind of like pitter patter with each other, and there's like not a huge amount of dialogue. We're just kind of seeing people do things, basically go about their daily lives, and seeing that within a space setting makes it all the more kind of like monotonous and sad and tragic.
Yeah, I mean, like there's the title card sequence, which is at the beginning when he is trying to basically jettison kind of extra cargo, quote unquote, and he's like unplugging these corpses that are in like cryo freeze or whatever, and like chucking them out of the spaceship, and we get the shot of just like the 5 or 6 bodies just floating down the screen, and like the title card of High Life.
By about 20 minutes into the movie.
Yes, which is great. Yeah, I love that. But that, or just like the sequence where it's when they're all gathered in that room and they're watching like up. I think Pattinson has the voiceover line where he says like, "We're moving forward, but we're getting further away from what's getting nearer." And you just get this shot of like the stars like condensing into this like ball. And, it's fascinating as well for a movie like this, which is a very small movie made by like, funded by like the Polish Film Institute, right? Like,
well, a shit ton of different like things. You look at like the various different resources to get the 8 million euros for this budget.
Very cheap.
Yeah.
But the space like shots look great, and especially just again, like I always think of that shot where the stars are like kind of coming into like that ball. It's so terrifying, but also there is like a genuine beauty to it, of course, because like as terrifying as it is, it also is kind of fascinating to see all this stuff. Around the time that this movie came out, NASA released that like image of the first black hole ever like photographed,
right? And
it looks very much like the black hole at the end of this movie. And so it's also just that kind of interesting thing of Claire Denis has never made a sci-fi movie before or since, and yet she clearly does care about the kind of scientific validity of like what's being portrayed here, of course, because I think she has a couple of co-writers as well.
Well, the one guy who's like her recurring Jean-Paul Fargeau, I believe, who also like co-wrote Trouble Every Day and a bunch of her other movies, is the co-writer here.
And then there is also like, additional writing by Jeff Cox, Andrew Litvak, and Nick Laird. So I'm assuming they're kind of the more like they sound like they sound like scientists' names.
Oh, I also want to shout out because I watched like a featurette earlier today. Orline Barreau, who was apparently like the physicist slash cosmic consultant on the movie, who talked a lot about how like he basically gave Denis like the basic restraints of like, oh, hey, consider the laws of physics, or these like very like basic things that would be like scientifically accurate about like somebody traveling in space, and then add whatever you want to that. And I think that's really exemplified with stuff like the flash we get of Mia Goth in her spacesuit, kind of like floating in zero G.
Yeah.
Which I think is such a great example of like kind of that groundedness fitting onto Mia Goth, who, you know, we should probably talk about a bit. And, you know, interesting, like this is kind of like during her rise up, because this is shortly after, you know, Cure for Wellness and Suspiria, where she's kind of like coming up, and just a fascinating, also very unique visually actor.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways.
Which the movie kind of comments on, by the way, with the
Right.
the one person who's like, I just want to punch your face into a little pulp. And I love when she does that, like, that nose, that voice, which is really, really funny, if a little mean, I will admit.
Right. Yeah, though, if certain things are to be believed about Mia Goth allegedly on the set of Maxine, maybe
Allegedly.
not. Allegedly. We don't know anything. Yeah, at the same time, like, she's such a fascinating performer because, like we're mentioning, she has this very distinctive look. She has, like, the kind of button nose and her very, like, wide eyes. And she's played many times kind of like these kind of creepy but alluring, fascinating characters. And we kind of talked about the voice angle of it. I say this with, like, as much respect as I can. She sounds like a Dickensian orphan. Which is like a fascinating contrast to her. Just like, please, sir, can I have some more?
Yeah, she really does, yeah.
Especially, I remember there was that one clip that was going around where she was talking about, like, what would she do if she wasn't an actor? And she was talking about, like, I'd like to make chocolate. Which is so fucking funny. Like, of course that's what you would do, Mia Goth.
Yeah, oh man. It makes sense that Claire Denis would get someone like Mia Goth who is very, like, instantly memorable for something like this, where it's a bigger cast and everyone feels very distinctive here. You know, like, that's the thing about, like, you know, often with movies that are set on ships, not just spaceships, but like water ships, and you have kind of these big crews. Like, I feel like people can blend into each other, and you're like, wait, who's that guy? Is he? No, that's the other one. You know, you can do that. And for me, at least, and maybe it's because, like, one of them is Andre 3000, but you know, they don't feel like, they feel separate and they feel very distinctive, and I really like that about this movie. And they all feel like they have their own personalities too. Like, Mia Goth is like I think the first scene we see of her is when she's like carving the thing with the knife into the wall, and then
Right.
Pattinson has to like get her off, and like I think he punches her in that scene. And that's also where we get one of my favorite close-ups in the movie, which is when they're like holding hands, and like you get the shot of like the blood in between like their fingers and everything. And it's just this very viscerally intimate scene that I love, and it's just like that one shot.
And also, it helps, I think, with Goth and Pattinson, and I think especially a lot of, like, the younger folks in that crew. They all do feel like they've been put through sort of, you know, we mentioned like a kind of imprisoned industrial complex sort of thing, especially when we get kind of the few flashes of them on Earth before the mission happens.
Right.
And there's like the scene where they're like riding the train, like on top of it and everything. And they all feel genuinely like, oh, I could see this person like existing in this environment. They don't feel like,
Right.
you know, a Hollywood actor pretending kind of deal. They feel a lot more authentic when you see that element of it. So when they're all together and, you know, they do what they do on that spaceship, it feels a bit more authentic than like all of that kind of, you know, abandonment really helps to like really crystallize it. Like, even when they're in like, in theory, a more controlled area of like, you're in space, you're in these corridors, which I love the way that like that one blue hallway looks basically like a prison hallway, and their bunks are off to the side, and it feels so much like, even though in theory this should be a more controlled environment, they are still volatile because they're trapped in this place in a, you know, a way that gets paralleled later with the dogs. They get kind of stir crazy. They get space madness.
Clearly this is a bad idea from the start, but like, putting a bunch of criminals in space is a horrible idea because, yeah, they will just get, like, cabin fever immediately. Like, it's such a horrible idea. I also do want to talk about the look of this movie a little bit, because you mentioned the scenes on Earth, and they're all shot on this, like, really grainy, like, I think it's shot on, like, 16 millimeter, and then everything in space is kind of more traditional, like, 35 or whatever. And I just love when they cut to those Earth shots, especially the shots on the train, because they just look so gorgeous and just so, like, there's so much texture to them, and they look so different to the scenes we get in space. And I mean, even the scenes in space look great, of course, like, just all the close-ups and everything look absolutely incredible. This movie is shot by Yorick Lesu, who is a great cinematographer, who also shot Little Women, the Greta Gerwig Little Women, which is also a gorgeous-looking movie.
A movie that also takes advantage of kind of like the different sort of color temperature to get you immersed in like in the individual scene, which is really helpful with this movie, where you got, like I mentioned, like that stark blue for like the one hallway with the bunks, but then also that kind of like almost urine-y yellow for like the lab that they're in.
The garden has, like, it's just all green and lush and, like, overgrown eventually. Yeah,
you get a real sense that like every single part of this ship has a distinctive feel to it. That's really fascinating, which really helps, especially when you even get different versions of that with, like, whether we're seeing the flashbacks and it's full of like these, you know, imprisoned folks that are like on edge, or, you know, a little baby trying to live. And I think it's interesting when Denis kind of talked about this. I have a quote for her where she says, in terms of like the non-linear stuff, she said, quote, "I always wanted to start with a man and a baby as a ritual of two living persons with no despair in the moment. Then there would be flashbacks bringing in all the despair." And I think that's like really fascinating, especially when you see like how visually it's contrasted when we see kind of like the flashbacks versus the, in theory, modern day scenes. It feels so much like, even with like the same lighting, the room just has a different energy.
Yeah. And I think you were talking about the kind of different locations on the ship, and this is another thing I think about a lot when talking about, you know, how do you, on a very small budget, portray and sell the fact that, like, no, these are actors on a spaceship out in space. They're not on, like, a sound stage in, like, London or France or whatever. And I think you get a real sense of, like, location in terms of, like, all of these sets, all these rooms are really well detailed and really, like, gorgeously decorated. You never get lost on, like, where are they on the ship. You have a somewhat of a sense of where things are. Oh, he's in the garden, that's separate from that hallway where they live, essentially, and stuff like that. And so, you know, she doesn't really kind of guide you through the ship necessarily, but you're always kind of aware of what room you're in because of, like, different lighting, different just geography, stuff like that, which I think, yeah, is just really great.
While still keeping that depressing, like, government functionality to the design of the ship at the same time. I think, which is fascinating. It feels like it's kind of like the evolution as well of, like, we mentioned Alien earlier. That kind of like, oh, this is like a space truck that is, like, mainly just, like, functional to get, like, somebody from place to place. And I think even here, managing to find, like, a beauty in that kind of sterility is really fascinating, especially as, like, Willow gets older as we go along, which I want to shout out the actress who plays, like, the kind of teenage version of Willow, Jessie Ross. I think, like, seeing her, you know, live in this environment that is, like, her home, her only kind of world that she's ever had, is, like, her dad and this ship, and seeing her, you know, try and, like, find some kind of things, like her praying at one point, or her looking at, like, the footage they have of, like, the fucking, what's, like, the bagpipes and shit, like the opening ceremony for,
it's like a football game or something. I don't know.
Right, yeah, it's like the opening ceremony for, like, a Scottish football game, I think.
It's all, like, grainy, like digital noise, though. Like, there is something really, like, I don't know, like, it's like something's getting lost in translation, basically, because she has no context for these kind of scenes anyways.
Right, like, it feels like they ripped a bunch of, like, 480p YouTube videos from, like, 2008 to put on this ship, basically, as historical records from Earth.
Yeah, well, and there's, like, this is slightly off topic, but, like, there's certain scenes where, like, it looks like it's shot with, like, a lower quality camera. Like, there's a scene where they're crawling in the hallway, and it looks like a CCTV footage or something. Like, I don't know. There are certain scenes like that which I think are are really interesting.
But her managing to like find kind of a beauty in these like horrible circumstances and seeing like
Right.
through Pattinson's perspective. Of, like, there's that point where she's praying and he says like, do you even know what God you're praying to? And it's like, I don't know, I saw the footage from Earth, and so I've got to like pray to something.
I want to know what they feel, which I think is such
Right.
a beautifully like profound line, because I don't know if that actress actually sounds like that, but she has a very distinct accent where it almost adds to the fact that like, well, she wasn't raised in like a school, and she was raised only with Robert Pattinson to teach her English, and so she has kind of this very distinctive weird voice.
You just get a full different perspective of like even like a shitty place that once again we're considering like functional, because we know the background of like this is a government funded thing and this is all like very piecemeal, barely put together just to like cut costs and whatnot. From her eyes, this being her only world, she finds like so much beauty in that. I think it really details such a fascinating thing on like perspective, which is like what so much of this movie is about, really. Because we get a lot of stuff from Pattinson's perspective, but even certain other characters, like, let's talk about Binoche.
Yeah.
A bit more. Juliette Binoche as our mad sex scientist once again. A great example of, you know, the traditional kind of like what many movies and fiction in general kind of seek out about like a compelling villain being someone who like thinks that they're 100% right even when they're doing horrible stuff. And I find that so compelling from Binoche, and even like the way that Denis has written this character, which we should also mention, this movie didn't have a traditional screenplay to any extent. It was apparently like a 60-page treatment as opposed to like the traditional 120 or so pages that like a normal script is, with like a lot more dialogue and more specific scene direction. So it's basically like a long outline is what everybody had to work off of. And I find that really fascinating, especially with like a Binoche, who in theory has most of the plot relevant stuff in terms of like she orchestrates a lot of like these sexual experiments that are going on, and she has these like incredibly upsetting moments with some of these inmates. But you get a whole sense from Binoche the whole time that she's like really believes she's doing good, at least as much good as she can do under these circumstances. Right. Which I think makes her like an incredibly interesting, you know, like I mentioned, like a mad scientist of sorts for like the, you know, the sci-fi angle of it. She's Dr. Victor Fuckenstein, ostensibly, in this movie. Victoria Fuckenstein, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, she has that line right, I think, after she comes out of the fuck box, and she like says to Pattinson, "I know I look like a witch," and so she's obviously very aware of how she comes off to these people, but I think there's also the angle that like she thinks she is kind of better than that all of them. Like she has that scene in the hallway where she's like, "You're all just a bunch of like petty crooks and criminals. Like my crime was the only one worthy of the name." And so it's like, Jesus, like she really has a high like opinion of herself. It's weird because this movie's very upsetting and has a lot of really fucked up things. There's a lot of really funny moments, I think. I think this movie has quite a bit of humor, to the point I remember this interview with Pattinson where he was talking about how him and Claire Denis were watching it and just cackling the whole time, which is, I think, says a lot about both of those people. But like, for example, like that scene where Pattinson and Binoche are talking outside the fuck box, and Pattinson says to her, "You're foxy and you know it." So funny. And you know, yeah, and or just like speaking of Binoche, like later she has that line, I think, talking about Mia Goth, where she talks about referring to Willow's big booty mother. just so funny.
Which even comes up in a more devastating moment later on.
Yes,
just
right.
like revealing Willow's parentage to Pattinson, just like you and her big booty mother. She comes from good genes. I agree with you. There's some of that stuff. Like there's that I mentioned, the Italian thing that fucking Andre 3000 says, or even the bit where at some point someone calls, I believe, Binoche the shaman of sperm.
Yes, Robert Pattinson said, yeah, she's a shaman of sperm. It's so funny.
Right, because she keeps taking like sperm samples and is trying to like use them to like impregnate some of the female passengers, which especially comes to like with like that one deeply upsetting bit where she like takes that baby out of the incubator, and we only see like a little bit of this like shriveled up, almost eraser head baby.
Oh right,
that
yes.
she like brings out.
Yeah.
She's like tearfully crying over it, which is even more impactful when you find out like about Binoche's past and like why she's like on this prison ship ostensibly because she like killed her children and her husband. Especially in that scene where like Mia Goth like directly asks her about it, which is like so fucking like it's very cold and you can see kind of like the emotion welling up in her a bit, but she's very practical about it in the way that once again makes her one of these like fascinating villain characters. Mia Goth asks like, "Did you killed your kids?" Like, "Yep, and my husband too." Just like very like frank about it.
And I think the way Mia Goth kind of says like, I would have killed myself, and Binoche just very quietly goes like, I tried that, and it didn't work, and she's come to terms with her situation, of like I'm in space and I have been like cast away from society as well in a way, and I have to like live amongst all these criminals. But she has like, again, is driven by something, whereas I think all these other characters are just kind of like, what the fuck? What is this? This is insane. This is like madness. Because you mentioned like she's taking their like sperm, and I think the implication is that she's like giving them sedatives, right? Because she's giving them like a pill when they give her the like jar of sperm,
right?
And so I think the implication is that she's sedating them, but also there's like the weird thing with her hair, because she like puts this like thing in her hair, and she has this like long hair like down to her like waistline, and there's like the scene where she's standing in that air conditioner, like the vent. I almost read it as like, is she using like pheromones to try and get like the men to go after her? It's so strange, right? Because you get like the one guy who ends up having a stroke. He like starts like
yes
brushing up against her, and then like scummy Bo Burnham is like masturbating in the doorway.
Right. And there's a point where she like goes to this guy who, like I mentioned, has had like a stroke and was like convulsing and like foaming at the mouth, and later on he asks her to suck his dick,
which is kind of funny but also really fucked up.
I mean, I'm more considered like upsetting and tragic, but you know, you can be you, Bryan. That's fine. But no, there's like a weird patheticness to like that like, once again, like these people have been reduced because of like her experiments to just like, you know, horny fuck machines that want to like, you know, have some kind of release because of, like you mentioned, like the pheromones and all this other stuff, the fuck box being this, you know, looming presence. It's kind of like the HAL 9000 of this movie, the fuck box. But yeah, just that she's reduced this guy who was like, suffered like so violently to like just his only desire is to get off, and that's when she like euthanizes him basically,
right? Yeah, at
that point, like I have like a weird kind of mercy killing kind of thing that's like deeply upsetting. I think that's a big thing, is like these are people who have done horrible fucked up things. Some are more fucked up than others, as we kind of see with like that fucking Bo Burnham creep, and what he tries to do to Mia Goth and shit like that. But even like Binoche has that as well. Like the way that Willow is conceived is a horrific rape of both Pattinson and Goth,
right?
In this like deeply upsetting way that once again is like clouded under the idea of like, but for science and all this other stuff. And I think it's a movie that is dealing with a lot of these upsetting things, which, you know, if you look at any of the other Claire Denis movies, she travels in these waters a lot. I was talking about Trouble Every Day. That has one of the most upsetting climaxes in a movie I've ever fucking seen. That's like deeply just unsettling on like so many levels, and deals with a lot of, you know, like sexual violence and all this other stuff, but I think in a way that at the very least doesn't feel exploitative and feels very like ingrained into what the story's actually trying to convey about. You know, in this case, once again, like being up in space and feeling like, oh, this is all under the guise of like, you can progress forward and help us with science, like that veneer. But really, it's just kind of like putting all of our troubles, these like troubled people that we completely failed as a system on Earth, and putting them out into space and having them, you know, pour out with this violence and rage and rape and all this other stuff in this environment that's like far away from us, that we don't have to deal with it, and we just see that like that shit is going on because, you know, they're just abandoned out there in a way that they were kind of on Earth already.
It's such a fascinating element of this movie, and I think in a different movie that stuff would either be so at the forefront of what whoever made it was trying to say, or it would just be in the background. And I think she finds the right amount to kind of push that to the audience of like, no, but this is what this is about, right? It is about the prison industrial complex and how this is the direction it would take in like a in a future where space travel is like a convenience, I suppose.
Especially down to, like, we've mentioned him a couple of times, but Andre 3000's character is like this very interesting figure. Cherney, right? Is that how it's pronounced?
Yeah, so I think he says that these Russian people, I guess in prison, I assume, like, would call him Cherney, and he says, like, I think it means black, but who knows. He is really great in this movie. I think he is very incredible.
He's amazing, and especially like his whole like background as he talks about it. Like the main reason he agreed to do this was because he has like a wife and son at home, and he was just like, well, if I'm able to do this, then I can take care of them in theory. But as time goes along, he talks about how like, well, my wife was really upset about me doing this, and she said it feels like, you know, burying me a second time, implying that like the first time would be like when he was sent to prison initially. And just like, you know, it's a complete abandonment, especially the way that when he first talks about that, like, well, at least my son's being taken care of. That's all that matters to me. And Pattinson in the coldest way is just like, your son's an old man or probably dead by now, just because of like the way we travel. And there's that shot of Andre 3000. He just looks dejected, like, oh, I guess this wasn't worth it. It's such good acting, especially considering like, obviously, like, you know, Andre 3000 and Outcast and all this other stuff. Such a fascinating figure who, when you look at his acting career, as well as, like, bizarre, like, especially of, like, since Outkast ostensibly broke up, it's only been, like, semi-pro, the Will Ferrell movie with basketball.
Right.
The Jimi Hendrix movie, Jimmy All By My Side.
Yes.
This, and then the two recent ones, Showing Up and White Noise. Like, that's it over the course of, like, 15 years.
Right, and I just, you know, I love that he has chosen, in the recent years, of course, to, like, work with his three directors are Claire Denis, Kelly Reichardt, and Noah Baumbach. Very, very big indie filmmakers, and in all three of those, he is giving kind of very different performances, because in this, he is very dejected and very, like, quiet, embracing how much older he's gotten, right? Like, his gray beard and just how, like, you know, you can tell this is a guy who has, like, been through stuff and has experience and just kind of like, you know, has all of that. And then in Showing Up, he is like very gentle, will take someone's art, be like, yeah, it's pretty good. And like, that's kind of his whole vibe in that movie.
Or even in White Noise, he's playing like a very quiet intellectual who's just kind of like off to the side talking to Adam Driver. And it's like, especially in that movie, he just like suddenly shows up. It's almost like a jump scare, like Andre 3000.
Yeah.
I didn't know you were here. By the way, I'm glad that the fuck box allowed him to find the middle ground between Speaker Box and The Love Below. You know.
That was pretty good. Well, I was also going to say, he has, like, also these lines that I think are, you know, he's very quiet and very subtle in this movie, but, like, he has the line after the, I forget her name, but the one who's pregnant at the beginning, Electra is the character's name, played by Gloria Obiano. After she died, and he says, like, even up here, like, black people are the first to go. And it is this line where you're just like, oh, wow. It's very impactful, and I think really adds to, like, all that stuff we were talking about earlier with the whole prison industrial complex thing.
But also, I think it's interesting that he's oldest of kind of, like, the more traditional inmates. It isn't, like, he's, like, what, a bit younger than Binoche, but at the same time, he's much older than, like, the average age group, where we're talking about, like, Mia Goth and Lars Eidinger, who I believe plays Chandra, the guy you were talking about earlier. And then also, I want to shout this person out, Agata Buzek, who plays Nansen. Another just incredibly striking individual who just looks, and I don't mean any disrespect by saying this, looks alien. Like, truly like a creature from a different world in a really fascinating way, which especially makes her very distinct when she ends up getting brutally murdered by Mia Goth so she can go on her little joyride out of space, which there's like so much weird built-up tragedy leading to that point, obviously, because this is after she's been forcibly impregnated, and there's that really sad shot of her like lactating, and just like being covered in her own like mess of milk and just like pushing people away, which immediately should be like, I want to get the fuck off the ship, and I'm gonna do that by murdering this person with a shovel, the most like brutal possible way to do it, and then going on this space tour, you know, through the black hole that leads to my head exploding. Just
right.
like, what a depressing series of events that we lead here.
Around this time, I think because of all like the black hole stuff, like news that was coming out in like with NASA and stuff, and I just like will never forget reading about the term spaghettyification, which is what happens when a human body like encounters a black hole. It like one of the most terrifying concepts, and like you kind of get to see it in this movie with like the way her like body stretches out and like her head like explodes. It's again one of the most just scariest depictions of space travel, I think.
And honestly, like all of this stuff that I'm describing feels like it could be in a trauma movie, right? Where it's like there's a fuck box, there's head explosions, there's a world where you could make this like a cheapo indie like sci-fi movie. Like I mentioned, that trauma vein that's like a bit more, confrontational. But I like the fact that this feels, because of Denis' style, it's done in a very stark, quiet way. It just has all this tragedy unfold, once again while contrasted by Willow growing up. Yeah, it really like envelops you in kind of like the weird element of like this movie is so much about time and its progression forward and how we perceive and all this other stuff. But I just love how the movie indicates like all these are like Pattinson's memories kind of flooding back to him and how it's like really upsetting him. Like early on there's the bit where he sees Mia Goth like floating in his head, and then he like we cut immediately to Pattinson on the ground like crying and wailing and just like looking back at that moment and thinking about her necessarily. And I think it just does a great job of like having all of that really encompass Pattinson while like bursting us back into the reality of like him raising this kid, and especially like the moment where Willow turns from like the infant that we see for so much of the movie into a teenager. And we first see her like laying next to him in bed and he's like, "You're too big, go over in your bunk," kind of thing.
He literally kicks her out of the bed.
Right, like quite literally. And you just see Pattinson like, because the kind of aging thing we were talking about with like Andre 3000 with Pattinson, it's really interesting because you see a bit of tuft of like kind of white graying hair like in the corner, and then when we cut to like that moment, he almost looks kind of like bleach gray in a weird way.
Yeah.
He hasn't really changed that much physically just because he's in the weird kind of space travel, but the hair is like the one indication of like, oh no, he's aged decades kind of on like a an actual time level versus what he's experiencing, where he's just like, I don't know, I went kind of gray. I kind of had a Steve Martin thing, I got gray a bit early, but I think I'm making it work.
He looks kind of just like ill and just kind of like malnourished or something, he looks kind of like just a bit sickly, but yeah, they don't do anything like over the top like old man makeup or anything, which is good.
I don't know, I would have wanted to see, we talked about Prometheus earlier, like him going full Mr. Burns, Guy Pearce makeup. Just, Willow, we have to go into the black hole. Let me get my walker.
Oh, man. Yeah, I'm trying to think what other...
You know what? Bryan, we keep mentioning this fuck box. We keep kind of referencing the fuck box. Let's actually go into a bit more detail. Let's open the box with, privacy, respectful privacy.
Right, you got a door.
Time with the fuck box, right.
Right.
But tell people, especially who maybe are for some reason listening this far deep and haven't seen High Life.
The device that Julia Binoche uses, it looks like the thing from that George Clooney builds in Burn After Reading, but like in space, basically.
And a bit more sleek. There isn't like a fucking local sex shop dildo bought for like $40.
There's fur. There's like. Yeah, it is this.
Also, it's a very sleek like dildo that's like coming out of it. That's like very like silvery
like
and smooth. Chrome, yes.
We get a great shot of Julia Binoche like sliding a condom onto it, which is so great. And yeah, it like expunges the liquid like out of the side of the box, which is kind of. There's no drain or anything there. I don't know where all that stuff goes.
It's just pooling down there. It's so really gross. Fucked up, man.
There's also, I'm sorry, that reminded me of another really funny line in this movie, which is when Pattinson is talking about like the sexual experiments that like Julia Binoche is doing, and he says, "I kept all my fluids to myself," which is
that funny, he did.
I think.
And I believe she calls him a monk at one point.
Right. Yes, because he has chosen abstinence. He doesn't use the box. Juliette Binoche doesn't get his sperm specifically.
Mia Goth makes fun of him directly about that. Just,
Right,
like,
so
sings, like, mockingly sings at him, and Andre 3000 just like, man, I get it, you just jerking off all the time, you can go forever with that. Yeah.
Right, he also, has a great line where he's just like, this fucking box, man, fucking crazy. Right after she leaves, we see piece of shit Bo Burnham go in. We don't see how it works for, like, men.
I assume there's a hole, Brian.
Of course, right, yeah.
Maybe they're really cheaped out with it. Just they have this extensive, like, saddle for, like, a woman to ride in for a guy. It's just like, we put a fleshlight, like, glued it on. To, like, the one wall.
Well, like, the scene where we get with Julie Binoche where she uses it is also this, like, it's slow and it's, like, so sensual in, like, how she's, Claire Denis loves to depict, like, human bodies. Like, she has a real fascination with just, like, the human body, and she loves to, like, linger on just, like, shots of people's arms or just, like, their stomach or whatever. Like, it's something that she does in a lot of her movies, and this scene especially, like, the way it is, like, it's showing, like, her back muscles, like flexing. It looks absolutely insane, and just the shots we get of Julia, like, her face as she's doing, like a bit of this, going, like, twisting her head back and forth.
Well, especially in sort of, like, the stark black environment that, like, is depicting the box, where it almost kind of looks like the empty abyss blackness of Under the Skin, another movie of, like, a similar time period. It's a black void where you, like, expel all of your, like, sexual frustration ostensibly. It's kind of like, in a gym where you have, like, the boxing, like, bag that you, like, hit. It's just like, you gotta, like, let out some steam. You gotta, like, really, like, work that out in your own way.
Yeah, but in a movie that is already upsetting and disturbing and filled with liquids of all kinds, this element on top of it is just so insane and so crazy. And I love that Claire Denis chose to go even further with how crazy and wild this premise is, but also it feels very in line with her sensibilities, where, like, the idea of a fuck box is kind of funny. Again, it's called the fuck box. Like, they don't kind of beat around the bush with it. But also, like,
hey.
God. But also, there are these implications, like, and these kind of, what, God, I can't believe this is a sentence I'm saying. What the fuck box represents, basically, right? Like, that, like you said, letting off steam, but also just this, like, element of the ship where it's like, why was this designed? And, like, clearly it was designed for, like, these sexual experiments and for, like, to let off steam in this. It's very weird. I don't know. I don't know how else to describe it.
I really wish there was a scene depicting Earth and Juliette Binoche, like, kind of explaining the budgeting for this to, like, whatever government officials. Just like, so yeah, you need a lab. That makes sense. You're doing some experiments. You need, quarters for these people. Yeah. What's this FB part of the blueprint you got?
Why is it so expensive?
Right. It seems pretty expensive, and you want us to put in, like, a car wash thing to, like, clean off, like, this one scene. And she's just like, oh, it's very important for my experiments. I need to, have an isolation booth and study, all this stuff. It's like, all right, well, you're the boss, I guess, sure.
Well, this is the thing also, like, you were mentioning kind of, like, if this were a different movie. And I also thought of, like, if this were a different movie, I feel like there would be a lot more scenes on Earth, right? We would get, like, a scene in the big boardroom, kind of 2001 style, explaining what this is. Because Claire Denis has, like, this very stark style, we don't get any of that. And we don't get, like, any scenes with people explaining things or talking about it or anything. And I think it adds to this kind of mysterious, stark, and weird quality to this movie, which I love. I think that's, like, it's great that she didn't include a scene where people are like, yeah, so this is what the experiment is and what you'll be doing and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, she's way smarter than that, and she knows how to tell this story in a really interesting way.
Well, one other thing I want to bring up before we get to the ending, we should note, as we kind of mentioned earlier, this is the first Claire Denis film who has often made films in French. that is English language, like pretty much entirely.
Oui.
And oui. And she talked about the fact that, like, because she had been planning this movie for, like, apparently, like, 15 years or so. This is kind of like a passion project thing she wanted to finally get off the ground. And she said, quote, "I had a screenplay which was naturally in English because the story takes place in space. And I don't know why, but for me, people speak English or Russian or Chinese, but definitely not French in space."
That's a really interesting point, actually. Yeah, or even in movies where they depict, like, oh, there's this space mission and we have, like, Americans, Russians, and Chinese and whoever else. It's never French people. Yeah, it's really interesting.
But I think that's fascinating, especially considering, like, before this, at least the only other thing I'd seen of hers that kind of has English in it is Trouble Every Day. But once again, that's Vincent Gallo saying just like, "I'm sorry, honey, I gotta, like, go away from our honeymoon so I can talk to the scientist guy." Like, that's most of the English in the fucking movie. And I think it's very interesting whenever you do get international filmmakers making a movie in English. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes there is kind of like, is there going to be like a weird... something lost in translation or something like that. But I think she does a really interesting job of making this kind of feel like, not necessarily American, even though they're, I guess, technically are supposed to be American, like a lot of these people, except for Juliette Binoche. That is in theory what a lot of them are supposed to be, but at the same time, it almost feels sort of like they could be from anywhere, which I think adds to kind of the general kind of feel of this movie being like the desperation of not just the American prison industrial complex, but just the world in general kind of treating that. Even though we're speaking English here, it's all just like, it kind of treats us almost like a blanket statement. Just like, well, yeah, this is just the natural kind of way that, like, any English-speaking country would eventually use its space system, which is to say, kick them out. Well, that problem's over.
Right.
Now let's focus on not solving any problems on Earth.
Right. And it also, I think, speaks to, like, what we were talking about earlier of, this is a movie that was made for us Americans, like, during the Trump administration, but not to bring this up because no one wants to think about this. It was during a time where there was lots of, like, alt-right, a rise in politics worldwide, really, right? Like in the UK and in France and other places like that. And so it also just adds to those themes of just like, we are all living in hell, basically. Like, this is not just like Americans going through this. It is like a worldwide thing.
Yeah, that also just adds another factor where it's a very diverse crew, like we kind of mentioned earlier. Like, everyone looks distinctive, which I think makes it all the more upsetting, where it's just like, you want to have that basic kind of message a lot of the time of like, I don't know, if we all collaborated together, like we kind of mentioned with The Martian, just like if we all get together, put our differences aside and act like humans together, we can like really science the shit out of this, right, guys? Let's do it. Let's see Hamilton, and then we'll science the shit out of this. And this is a movie that really just presents it like, I don't know, no matter what your, creed or ethnicity or nationality or any of these other things, if you contain a bunch of people who've been fucked over by the world into one place, they will often just like really tear at each other, which especially, contrasts about the bit where, in the present time period, Pattinson and Willow discover a ship and he goes onto it and it's full of rabid dogs, which is fascinating. Feels kind of like a weird perversion in the same way of like we're talking about like scientific exploration of like the whole the dog who's like sent into space. In this case, it's like, oh yeah, we sent all these dogs into space to do what exactly? I don't know. They're just gonna be up there and I guess scientific experiment. And yeah, it just shows like that line between like a bunch of humans who have been rejected by society and a bunch of animals who've been rejected by society go up into space. Similar results may happen.
Yeah, and also just shows like how the government views these people, right? Like, they are basically animals essentially, and they don't view them as people. We also did briefly. I want to talk about like the design of the ship, which is very boxy. It looks very like,
yes, the outdoor, yeah,
right. And we see it has like a number 7 on it, and I think the ship, the dog ship, is like number 9, I think. And so the implication is that there's like many more of these, and if that dog one is any indication, I think it's also like there are different experiments going on all those different other ships that like we don't even know about, and maybe they're probably as fucked up, if not more fucked up than like what's going on this ship. And the way that scene is like shot in like just the darkness, and we get like that one dog that is like circling Pattinson, like almost getting ready to like jump him. It's so eerie and unsettling.
Especially the way that it's shot from like his perspective, and it looks like almost like
Right.
a green kind of like you mentioned the closed circuit TV kind of angle of it. Which, you know, there's that, and there's also God, that little fucking puppy that also comes up to him.
Oh,
It's
so
so
cute.
cute. And you're immediately like Willow as well, just like bring it on board, do it. And that's also a great scene where he confronts about like, you know, she tries to confront him about that. And it's like, I didn't want to contaminate you. It's probably covered in some kind of like space contamination. I didn't want to like bring that into your environment. And then later she's just like, you know what, you were right, Dad, I'm sorry. Which is like a sweet, like, once again, father-daughter thing. There's actually a bit of like disciplinary stuff there, which does really lead into like what I want to talk about with the ending. As I mentioned, after a certain point, Willow is like a teenager, and her and Pattinson are approaching this black hole that they've been like aiming toward for a while. There was initially like, you know, how Mia Goth died with like one black hole, but they find another one. This one has a very different like look to it. The earlier one that we got looked a lot more like kind of purplish and dark, and this one has a bit more like of a yellow light that's just like beaming across space that they see, and it's like it's so gorgeously depicted, that version of the black hole. And as they get closer, they realize like we're not exactly sure what this is gonna do to us, because we saw what it did to Mia Goth horribly earlier. The two of them just kind of going back and forth as they are leading on to like what could be their final mission is so fascinating, where it's a lot of like Pattinson kind of talking about like I don't know, this is probably, you know, it's a giant black hole, we don't know what's going to happen, it's probably going to be a bleak situation.
Like, I thought we were drifters, right? Like, he's kind of gotten accustomed to the idea of just like, we float around space. Like, that's just what we do. This is what life is now.
Right, as now they're coming toward like an actual destination, he's kind of confronting that with a bit more pessimism, versus Willow being a lot more, you know, kind of like fascinated by this and having a lot more kind of like interest, where it's just like, you know, it's reminding me of like what you guys were like initially sent here to do. And I know you don't really look back on like those people or yourself with like a lot of interest, like you mentioned the drifters thing, but I consider you all heroes to me and all this other stuff. It's this weird kind of depiction of what I really get from this movie, what I got like back when I saw this in 2019, and as I've gotten just older in the last 5 years, just it feels kind of like the existential dread of being, you know, late 20s, early 30s millennial, and kind of confronting the idea of like, should I have kids in an environment that like doesn't seem to be like conducive to like them progressing forward? It's something I've thought a lot about, I don't know, over the last 5 years or so, for some reason, maybe, I don't know what would make me think these things. But I find it like really tragically beautiful in its own way, that like she has this optimism, he has this pessimism about it, but they are confronting the same oblivion of going to this, you know, black hole. And just the build up to it, like the way they get into that ship, and then they're like seeing like the yellow outline kind of envelop them, and then just the amazing like last shot we get of Pattinson in this movie, of him like looking off to in profile and saying, "Shall we?" Willow also says like, "Yes, we shall." And then the yellow light envelops them, and then the movie leads into that Willow song in the end credits, which I think it genuinely affects me. This movie that features a fuck box like nearly makes me cry every time
And so
I watch this ending.
it's a fade to white too, which is so like, I don't know, that you know, we rarely get movies that fade to like bright white like that, and so
Right.
it's also just very striking. And I think also, you know, because the thing with Pattinson's character is he is like basically watched everyone he knew like either kill each other or die. I love Andre 3000's like death, quote unquote, because we don't see what happens to him really. We just see
Right,
him,
but
like,
you referenced it earlier, like he lays on the ground in the atrium with all the plants, and he dissolves away.
It's gorgeous dissolve, yeah. And also just the shot of him like rubbing his feet into the dirt, getting like one last kind of, you know, feel for some semblance of earth.
In that case, like basically it's implied that he just like gives up Like, he doesn't even die
Yes,
of, like,
which-
malnourishment. He just, like, he commits suicide by not giving a shit anymore.
Right, because I think at that point it is just... Benoist has died at that point, so it's just Pattinson, Andre, and I think there's one more member, but I can't remember. And so it also just that fact of, like, like, he could have easily just killed himself or given up or whatever, but he sees, like, Willow, this, like, baby, and I love that line when they're, like, getting into their spacesuits, and she's asking, like, do I look like my mother? Like, the nose, the hair, like, what do I look like? Yeah. And he says, like, you're special. You're unlike anything, like, anyone ever. And I love that about you. And it is just this, like, you can tell that, like, even though she was born under, like, these horrible and, like, traumatic circumstances, that, like, he has some love and some caring for her because she's special. Earlier in the movie, he says, I'm hers, she's mine. And it's just this beautiful, like, bond that they have together. And yeah, just that idea of, like, yeah, he could have just given up after everyone else died, but he keeps going. And the way that, like, the, finale of the movie, them going into this black hole is, yeah, it's uncertain. There's a bit of dread in there as well, because it is a black hole, a terrifying thing in space. But there is something quite hopeful about it because they are together. And I don't know, it is incredibly beautiful and tragic at the same time and scary. It really shows Claire Denis' filmmaking style, right? Like, all of those things describe her movies, right? All of her movies contain different elements of that. And it's what makes her such a fascinating filmmaker. And yeah, it's why this movie is so great. And I think I do also find myself going to that part of the movie a lot more and less the kind of oppressive, antagonistic side that the kind of the middle chunk is, where we get a lot of the stuff with the prisoners. We get, like, the attempted rape scene, which is, like, horrifying.
Right, especially it's followed up also by, like, a murder scene of that Bo Burnham awful rapist guy.
Oh, right, he gets, like, stabbed in the eye. Yeah.
But you really you fast forward to the fuckbox scenes and then you cry about the Willow stuff. That's basically what you...
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But also, I want to comment on this, because in that little featurette I was talking about earlier, that guy Barreau, the physicist who was consulting, mentioned that basically, like, in terms of what we know about the idea of, like, going toward this black hole, it's less of, like, an actual death thing and more of, like, basically experiencing the end of time. Is, like, basically what we've kind of conceived of. Right, which I think adds a fascinating edge to it, because I think it's coming from just the terms of, like, Pattinson has this pessimism about, like, we will die in this vacuum of space and we don't have anything, versus Willow seems to be approaching it from more of just, like, we're discovering something that no one else has been able to get toward. We're getting to, like, a weird vacuum, and we don't know what's on the other side of it. She has, like, definitely, she's not like, oh, this is going to be an incredible experience, but it's just like, I'm experiencing this with you, the only person I've known in my life who I love so much, and I wouldn't want to experience it with anyone else. And I think that also adds kind of that weird hopefulness in spite of literal oblivion that you're heading toward, which is, like, incredibly endearing.
Yeah, there's like a line Pattinson has early in the movie where he says, I can't remember who he says it to, but he says, like, if my old man could see me now, right? And it is just also this idea of, like, this, like, criminal, basically, like, has gone further than any human being has, like, ever. And also, yeah, that line that you mentioned that Willow has of, like, you're heroes to me. I don't know. There's a weird, sad beauty to that, I think, which, yeah, it's kind of what this movie is, really.
And especially with the sort of hard sci-fi concept that we're dealing with this season. I think it's interesting where it adds, like, all of these, like, societal problems and all these other things into this weird mix that eventually just leads to that interest in exploration that I think is, like, embodies, like, a lot of, like, what we, kind of talked about earlier about the, like, the Martian, like, sciencing the shit out of this is basically under the idea of, like, we can progress forward and we can become better as, like, a human species as we go out into the far reaches of space. And this movie depicts this as basically, like, Well, yeah, you can do that, but oftentimes you'll have to just get through just an endless muck of interpersonal conflict and a government that doesn't give a single shit about you and a world that seems to throw you into the trash of the deep recesses of space. But maybe you can get your way out of that trash can and you can find something that no one has ever seen before and may never see again. Which is kind of beautiful. And I think that's basically my final thoughts. I don't know if I have much else to add. Bryan, what about any final thoughts on High Life?
Well, I did want to mention just very briefly, because you mentioned that this is the first A24 movie we've covered.
Yes.
And this was also kind of part of their initial effort to get more international filmmakers and get more films by them, even if this movie is in English, obviously. But, I mean, them getting the first full English language film by Claire Denis is kind of a big deal. This was also the same year that they did Climax, the Gaspar Noé movie, and I think it really kind of just pushed. This movie did not make that much money, obviously, but
no, grossed $2.8 million in the U.S. So.
I contributed to that, but I think it did kind of signal A24's push to getting more international filmmakers, and getting more of their films released in the U.S., which I think is very impressive and very important, obviously, because, like I mentioned, a lot of her movies just were not available and still are not available, right? You can't really watch some of her movies by legal means, I will say. When I first
by going to your local library.
Right, of course. Wink. But yeah, just a studio like A24 kind of giving Denis this kind of platform, especially with someone like Robert Pattinson in the lead. I don't know. I really kind of appreciate that from them, even though we can sometimes clown on A24, rightfully so, for some things, like them charging just ridiculous prices for those Blu-rays. Come on, A24, what the hell?
Oh,
but
look, I want to have Love Lies bleeding in my collection, but it's
Right.
just too much.
Right.
Or that Stop Making Sense one as well. That looks
That's the
great, but
one.
I'm like,
I've
that's
been
so
eyeing it.
expensive.
Right.
Yeah. Have a sale, assholes.
Yeah, do what Criterion does. Come on. Yeah, I guess final thoughts on this movie. I really, really love this movie. I think it's a full-blown masterpiece, and it's not even my favorite Claire Denis movie, weirdly enough, which is really saying something for how much.
What would you say is your favorite?
I think 35 Shots of Rum. Gun to my head, that might be one of my. I said top 10 earlier. I think top 5 favorite movies. I really adore that movie. It's very different to this because it is very sweet and beautiful and kind of swooning as well. It's a very strange film to this, but I love that movie a lot. It's also one that you cannot stream, so. But yeah, I think she has such a unique style, right? From the kind of hypnotic, alluring quality, the very minimal use of dialogue, the stark way that she shows this story, the non-linearity as well, I think, which is so fascinating and is in all her movies, really. I think she really just knows how to tell a story in the most compelling way, even if she's making very different movies, whether it's a space movie, whether it's a movie about the French Legionnaire, an erotic thriller, or whatever. I think she just has a very unique style. She is one of the most fascinating filmmakers working today, in my opinion, and I love when any auteur gets to make a science fiction movie, but especially someone like Claire Denis, who has a very specific style and a very specific thing that she's trying to talk about in terms of whether it be colonialism or the prison industrial complex. But again, like you mentioned, I think wraps it in this kind of sweet and tender and super fucked up package that I think really hammers home the beauty in this movie, right? All obviously, what you said about the ending, of course, but at the beginning as well, right? With just starting with Pattinson and this baby just interacting together and having these beautifully sweet moments, like when he's trying to teach her how to walk. It's so adorable, and he's like up. It's just so great.
And apparently, those are the actual actress Scarlett Lindsay's first steps depicted on film.
I will say that baby is a great actor. Like you mentioned that strawberry scene, I'm like, that is really wonderful acting. Like, I don't know how they got that out of.
Also, by the way, having your first steps being shot by Claire Denis for this like A24 movie, I had a fucking camcorder. Looks like shit.
God. Oh man, yeah, but yeah, I really just adore this movie. I think Pattinson's incredible in it. I think Julia Binoche's great in it. Andre Benjamin is just weirdly great in it. Again, I'm just always compelled by the fact that he's in this movie, and I always go back to his performance, and his quote-unquote death scene is maybe my favorite moment in the movie. And yeah, a weird space science fiction movie, and truly just a strange movie in general. I really love it, and I think it's pretty damn good.
Yeah, I'll only briefly add one. This definitely encouraged me after like actually doing my fucking due diligence and watching some more Claire Denis movies. I definitely want to see more, especially the ones that, you know, I'm apparently not able to see because of the great system of streaming movies. Yeah, I definitely want to explore more of her work, especially considering that kind of contrast she does between like very engaging human interaction and a deep nihilism that's incredibly upsetting. I'm just like, sign me up, Claire. I'm down for more of that. And I also want to shout out something that I'm sure I'm going to post on the socials that we have. But I just want to really shout out, you mentioned Andre 3000. There's a bit during one of the interviews where they talk about the fuck box. And you see, like, they have interview, you know, like Pattinson and Mia Goth and all these people on set looking, you know, much more, like, usually in their costumes, ostensibly, just like in, like, more traditional garb. But we see Andre 3000, like, in a hoodie with sunglasses next to, like, one of the ships, just literally saying, you know, at one point talking about, like, oh, you know, I read the script and I read something about this fuck box. And I just thought to myself, I can't wait to see this fuck box. One of my favorite behind-the-scenes interviews I've ever seen.
God, the only way his performance in the movie could be better is if he had his flute. Do you know those stories about him just walking around LA with his like flute just randomly?
My dream is to walk down the street like feeling sad, and then Andre 3000 has a flute.
They're like
my day would completely turn around if I ran to Andre 3000 with a flute.
There are like multiple videos on like social media of people being like, "I'm at LAX, and here's Andre 3000 with like a beautiful like wooden flute. Like it's gorgeous and like, you know, all that stuff, and it's just like he's just playing the flute in LA. It'd be great if he had it on the ship with him."
Every time I hear about that dude, it just feels like, is this like the closest we have to an actual Willy Wonka? Just like a strange figure who like occasionally pops up outside out of isolation. And then if we were to go to Andre 3000's like actual home, would it just be like the chocolate factory? And there'd be Oompa Loompas who he just houses. He doesn't have them do work. They're just chilling with him.
Oh man, I love Andre 3000 so much. What a guy.
Yeah, you don't see Big Boy going around with that flute. Love Big Boy, but
God, you could have
he's
Big
not
Boy in this movie.
An Idlewild reunion. What everyone wanted. All right. On that note, I think it's time we transition into the segment we do every single episode, Between the Lines. So in every episode of Cinema to the Letter, Bryan and myself recommend another film that relates in some way to either the movie that we're talking about for an individual episode, or could be a potential alternate pick for, say, in this case, the I for Indie for Hard Sci-Fi. So Bryan, you're going first here. What is your recommendation for this edition of Between the Lines?
Yes. I also wanted to... This kind of fell into my lap a little bit because... I've been binging a lot of movies by this filmmaker, but also I think these are kind of similar movies in the sense that they are both one location this space station and showing the kind of isolation of people on a spaceship, I'm going with Steven Soderbergh's Solaris from 2002, which is a very weird movie for Steven Soderbergh to have made, especially because just off the bat, I think this is such a fascinating move for him to make, because he made this and Full Frontal, a movie that doesn't exist at all, right after he made Ocean's 11. These were his two follow-ups. If you don't know, and by the way, Solaris, which was also adapted by Andrei Tarkovsky in the 70s, but this version starred George Clooney as this psychologist, gets called to the space station Solaris because the crew there has gone crazy, basically, and doesn't want to leave, but also there are I forget what they call them exactly. I think they call them visitors. They have visitors of their loved ones who have passed, and it is this kind of weird moral dilemma of what do we do with this? They're trying to get them to basically stay there forever, and I really love Soderbergh's version. It is very different to the Tarkovsky version, because the Tarkovsky version is like almost 3 hours long, and this movie is 100 minutes. Soderbergh in the limey mode, right? Like the limey is a very minimal, all the fat has been cut from that movie. And it's the same thing, I think, with Solaris, where it is, again, 100 minutes. It's very short, and kind of like High Life, you are getting glimpses into his past through these kind of vignettes, and it's very dreamy, it's very hazy. It features an absolutely insanely good score from Cliff Martinez. I listen to that score like all the time, like in my free time. It's an incredible score. And it also just has this very just gorgeous like vibe that is awash with this like all this stark white, but also the kind of purple of Solaris, because it's this bright purple. The spaceship in this movie, I think, is really interesting because it is more of the sleek silver kind of thing. You know, like it looks more like Apple would have designed it, but in a good way. I think it's a gorgeous looking movie. It features a really great supporting performance from Viola Davis early on in her career, as well as Jeremy Davies. John Cho is in one scene of this movie, which is kind of interesting. And it's all shot in Soderbergh's incredibly efficient and just like no nonsense style, where he just, again, like Claire Denis, just kind of knows how to cut this thing down to just the core essentials that you need to know as an audience. And it's a bit alienating because of just how much it is like not interested in really carrying you or holding your hand along the whole thing. But I really, really love this movie. It is one of Soderbergh's best movies. It's a movie that I think, similar to you with High Life, the ending kind of devastated me. Like, I was just so deeply struck by the ending of this movie, which I won't spoil for anyone. But yeah, I really love this. I think, you know, Steven Soderbergh is one of my favorite filmmakers. And like I said, I've been binging a bunch of his movies, and the guy doesn't miss. And when he does miss, it, you know, you get a Full Frontal, you get a what's that? The
Good
laundromat.
German.
You get the Good German, right? But when he hits, it is incredible. I think he has such an incredible filmography, and I think Solaris is a really weird movie, especially because it stars George Clooney, who, again, at this time is a huge star, and just how weird and kind of alienating and how steeped in this particular vibe this movie is. But I love it, and I just love it the more that I see it over and over again. I don't think you've seen this movie. Is that correct?
No, I have not seen either version of Solaris. It's kind of the reason, like, I was planning on, honestly, watching, like, at least the original version of Solaris.
Sure.
And then maybe seeing the Soderbergh movie after that. But, you know, that's, like you mentioned, a 3-hour-long fucking movie.
Right, it's very long and slow.
And I was almost tempted when you told me this was going to be your recommendation to watch it, but I wanted to fit in a couple more Claire Denis movies.
Sure.
So I didn't quite have the time to do that. But I'm definitely curious, if nothing else, because I remember, not like exactly when this movie came out, but not too long after it, like the reputation around it was like radioactive.
Yeah,
It was
I
very
can imagine.
around the time. Particularly, it's one of the few movies to have an F cinema score, which if you don't know out there, cinema score is basically a thing that like they poll people after like the initial showings of a movie, like general audiences coming out of it. And it's usually like in LA and stuff like that, just general audiences coming out and saying like, hey, what'd you think of the movie? Rated on, an A to F scale. Right. And usually, you get somewhere between like an A- and a B+ for like most movies people walk out of. If they don't like it, it tends to be like, C or D levels. That exists, but there's like a very limited category of movies that have an F cinema score. I think it's around like only 20 or so. And Solaris was one of them in the history of that thing. So it's fascinating. It's a company with like the devil inside and like really bad horror movies and shit like that. But so I only really knew kind of like the bad reputation of it, just like, oh, it's really bad. How can the Ocean's 11 guy follow it up with this? But as I've watched more of Soderbergh's movies, including ones that were not necessarily well liked, like say not too long after this he does Ocean's 12, which was like incredibly derided. And I think it's a good movie. I think it's pretty solid. I would still say I prefer 11, but
it's a perfect movie.
Right, 12 is great. 13 is incredibly watchable.
Oh,
I think like an incredibly watchable, like solid movie. Definitely feels like let's go back to 11. We're sorry about 12. Let's go. It's kind of like that's why I would say it's the weakest of the Soderbergh movies. And then Ocean's 8 is a movie that does exist.
It does. That one I would say is watchable.
I think it's also watchable, but just it's in one ear out the other kind of watchable.
Exactly, yeah.
It's like I'm having a fun time watching it, and then I just don't think about it the moment the credits pop up ever again. But yeah, Solaris I definitely do want to give a watch for sure, because it's one of the few Soderbergh blind spots I have, honestly. So we definitely have to fill that at some point. But let me go ahead and recommend my particular pick, which is a more recent film from the greatest year of our lives, 2020. I have The Vast of Night, which is a very indie sci-fi movie directed by Andrew Patterson in his film debut. And basically it takes place in like the 1950s in New Mexico, and is about, it's a two-hander ostensibly between these two characters, Faye, played by Sierra McCormick, who is like a switchboard operator in this very small town in New Mexico, who is often buddy-buddy with Everett, played by Jake Horowitz, who is the local disc jockey. Like, it's an incredibly small town that's so small that, like, the big event that this movie kind of takes place around is the high school basketball game that the entire small town is going to. And so, like, we initially see, Everett kind of setting up about, like, oh, yeah, I'm gonna, like, get my equipment over, and, Faye apparently, like, helps him out with that a lot. You kind of get the impression that she has a crush on him, because they're both kind of, like, in their, like, late teens, so they both kind of have, like, a connection that feels friendly, but you can tell that she has a kind of a crush. But as the night goes on, Everett at one point hears something interesting on his radio that Faye also hears on her switchboard. That sounds like very odd, this weird noise that they can't quite place. And as the night goes on, this vast of night, we sort of see a real-time exploration of these two realizing they might have recorded some sort of alien UFO sound from a nearby spacecraft that might be near their town. And I saw this during the pandemic, so I was in a great state of mind when I watched it, but I just remember, and I covered this previously on the Double Edge Double Bill, like around the time it came out, and I just want to really emphasize that this is one of my favorite films of this decade so far, truly. I think it's such an incredible, especially for its very low budget. It cost $700,000. And they just put it all on screen, because the way Patterson shoots this is spectacular. This movie almost feels like one shot, like in its entirety. They have really clever ways to like cut around it, but there's so many scenes of like, because of the real-time exploration thing of it, where you follow like either Everett or Faye like kind of walking around doing like a bit of a almost Aaron Sorkin-y walk and talk, kind of talking to each other, and then you get like these great drone shots of like, especially like on the grass of like these neighborhoods. It's like kind of like the camera's wandering around, and it looks like immaculate for like such a small budget movie. And it really raises up the tension with every scene. It really gets you enveloped in like that sense of discovery that you're feeling along with the main characters. And the few other characters we do get are incredibly fascinating. Like there's a whole sequence where they're talking with a guy over the phone about like his encounters with this like UFO thing, and then they encounter like an old lady where she has a whole story about like her past with like UFOs and stuff, and it's an incredibly engaging 89 minutes. That's another thing. It's incredibly short, but it's like so engrossing, and it's like we mentioned, a very indie sci-fi movie that gives you a full glimpse at like what, you know, you can do with such a small budget that still at the same time makes it feel like you are stepping into a larger world, to quote a different science fantasy vaguely film. But yeah, it's an incredible movie. You've seen it, I can tell from your reactions. Are you a fan of The Vast of Night?
I did, yeah. I also watched it during the pandemic, and it was one of those movies, I think, in 2020 that was on streaming, and I had heard really good things, but I was like, I don't know what this is. I've heard some good things. I'm gonna watch a movie. There's nothing else to do in the world right now, and this shit blew my socks off, like, fully. I was so impressed by this movie. Yeah, all of those just really long shots are gorgeous and are so, like, precisely done in a way where I'm so fascinated for what this guy's gonna do next, you know? Like, I'm immediately just curious to see what he does. You mentioned that scene with the old lady, which I won't give away any context or anything, but it's one of the only things that has just made me, like, get full goosebumps all over my body. Like, I got full chills during that monologue that woman gives, because it is, like, just... I just didn't think I could get that kind of... That kind of chill just by someone describing something that happened to them. And it's absolutely incredible. I love just the amount of control that Andrew Patterson has for this, like, in this movie, and the amount of restraint he has, obviously because he has a very small budget, but also just there's so many things he does. It's been a while since I've seen it, so it's kind of hazy in my mind, but there are so many things he does that are not obvious, and the way he just lingers with these characters for extended period as they're just like using the phone lines and whatever. It's really incredible, and yeah, it's a really, really incredible movie. I immediately want to watch it again just by talking about it. I really love this movie. Great choice.
I'll at least say it's on Amazon Prime. That's who ended up buying it. And it's so you can, if you have Prime, you'd be able to see it. And I also just want to shout out, you mentioned like what's he doing next. I was thinking about this when I chose this to recommend, and I found out what his next movie is, and it immediately fascinates me. It's called The Rivals of Amisa King, and it's a crime thriller set in Oklahoma with Matthew McConaughey, Kurt Russell, Cole Sprouse, Owen Teague, Tony Revolori. I'm just like, what? That sounds interesting. I'm definitely down. Hopefully he's, this doesn't end up being like a sophomore slump kind of thing, because, just to see what this guy does with like an all-star cast like that, and a bigger budget, I'm sure, than $700,000. I think that would cover like Matthew McConaughey's weed budget, maybe, on that set. I don't know. But yeah, I hope to see this guy do more and more great stuff from here.
I agree.
Well, let's go ahead and repeat our titles for anybody out there in case you want to add them to your watch lists and whatnot, Bryan.
Yes, I had Steven Soderbergh's adaptation of Solaris from 2002.
And I had the 2020 little indie directed by Andrew Patterson, The Vast of Night. But on that note, let's go ahead and start wrapping up here. We want to, thank some people before we get out. We want to thank Burial Grid for our music for the show. Purchase this music at burialgrid.com. Thanks to Michelle Kyle for our artwork. Find her at MishKyle96 over on Twitter. And thanks to our supporters on Patreon, patreon.com/cinema2letter, where for just $1 a month, you all become Cineast patrons, and you get access to, polls where you get to vote for episodes we cover, like this one. All the Cineasts picked High Life, so you're all responsible for this episode. We firmly place that on you. Thank you so much. And also you get access to bonus podcasts that we cover. We at least do one big audio kind of thing for the month, which this month for July, when this is coming out, will be our top 10 sci-fi movie and TV gadgets and tech of sorts, which we'll be recording soon, and audio reviews for new movies that are out around this time. We're in the middle of the summer movie season, where I'm sure, Despicable Me 4 has completely dismantled the entire box office establishment.
It's cost $2 billion at the box office by this point, surely.
Right, surely, yes. Save Cinema, Gru and the Minions. We really appreciate all your service to us. Thank you so much. Bananas all around.
Italian people.
Bryan, you don't have to salute me all the time. I appreciate it. Thank you.
That's how I greet Thomas every time I meet him.
Right, yes. Just thank you for your service, even though he thinks I'm a minion, not Italian, still. Which is weird, because I'm pretty tall.
I keep asking Thomas to say banana, and he won't say it.
Right, and he keeps asking me to take off my overalls and show my butt, and I feel like that's an invasion of privacy, really. That's only for me and the fuck box to see. But, for $1 a month, you get access to more, silly stuff that we talk about, and it really helps out. It keeps the main show afloat, and allows us to do fun experiments over there. Not the sex kind of experiments. No.
Podcast experiments. Much more vile and disgusting.
Truly. The worst experiments. We do record in a fuck box, though. We don't really talk about. That's how you get the great acoustics you hear every week on the show.
And hey, the acoustics are great in here. There's lots of other reasons why we shouldn't, but hey, good audio.
Thankfully, Bryan turned off the dildo machine before we recorded.
Just been going quietly in the background.
But for more of our antics, if you somehow want to listen to more of this garbage, you can find us on whatever hell site that you explore for social medias over at Cinema #2 Letter. If we're there, we're at that handle. And you can find me on, Letterboxd and maybe Twitter at this point, at Not The Who's Tommy. And I also do occasional writing at film-cred.com.
Yeah, and you can also find me on Twitter, maybe, I don't know yet, we'll see, at BRYANDRADE and the number 3. Or you can follow me on Letterboxd to keep up with all of my Steven Soderbergh binge watching. At my name. You can follow me on there.
And for more of us and this space madness that we're in the middle of, you can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or other podcasting platforms. If you're listening on Talk Film Society, our podcast network, you might listen to all the other great shows that are on there. And you can also dig into the archives and our Podbean main feed for the first 5 seasons of this show and all of the 5 years of Double Edge Double Bill stuff, all there for you to peruse. And nothing else, if you can't support us on the Patreon for the $1, that's cool. Even that much money can be tight for some people, but the free way to help us out is to rate, review, or simply share the show around to give us more visibility, which we really need as we hurtle through space without anybody to really guide us, not even children, to help us guide the way into the bleak black hole of space.
Yep.
Well, we'll just, follow up by saying, teasing our next episode, our N for New pick, which, we kind of teased earlier. Robert Pattinson starred in this movie, High Life, and we'll be talking about his Twilight co-star, Kristen Stewart, as part of the interesting ensemble for the 2022 David Cronenberg film, Crimes of the Future, which I'm very curious to talk about. I remember this was when we kind of reunited back in 2022, Bryan. This is one of the first theater experiences we had together.
It was.
Seeing Crimes of the Future, yeah.
Kind of weird to think about for this movie in particular, but yeah, I'm super excited to watch it again and, talk about Cronenberg, talk about Kristen Stewart, of course, and, gonna get my purple bars of plastic for that episode as well.
The yummiest ones that we won't eat on mic.
I eat my plastic in private.
Right. Not public plastic, private plastic. No, but that's next time. And until next time, Bryan, shall we?
Let's go into that black hole. Nothing bad will happen. No spaghettiification.
Whee!